Last year, I had the opportunity to chat with Ed Logg. Ed is truly a pioneer in the world of video games. His credits as a designer and programmer include games like Asteroids, Gauntlet, Centipede, and many more. In preparation for talking with Ed, I tracked down every interview with him that I could, with the intent of asking questions that hadn't been thoroughly covered in previous interviews. Ed has gone into great detail as to how many of his games were made, but I wanted to try to focus more on the why. Through my research, I got a picture of Ed as being a very pragmatic programmer and game designer. You might be familiar with the Tengen version of Tetris for the NES, which was released in 1989. This was the first console version of the game to be published in America, and it was programmed by Ed Logg. Ed had played another version of Tetris and quickly found himself hooked, so he urged Atari, his employer at the time, to put out a home console version. Years later, when asked why he wanted to work on a home conversion of Tetris, he replied, "As with many of my games, this was the best idea I could think of at the time. However, in this case, because I enjoyed it so much, it was an easy decision. What better way to play the game you like so much and make sure it comes out the way you like?" That quote in particular really helped to frame this video for me. Through it, I think we can see both Ed's practicality and his love for video games. Balancing that mathematical approach of a game programmer and the end goal of a fun video game is fascinating to me, and throughout his career, Ed was able to expertly balance both of those things, while at the same time meeting the very specific demands of both the arcade and home console markets. Today, almost every game you play has been directly influenced by some other game. Through generations of video game design, certain ideas or conventions have become so ubiquitous that it's easy just to take them for granted. Control schemes have become largely uniform for most types of games, and even gamepads themselves have become mostly standardized. When Ed Logg began making games, developers were obviously going to be looking to the work of other developers for inspiration. But so much of what has become standard in gaming today was still unexplored territory at that time. Arcade games that Ed worked on often employed novel mechanics and control setups that either hadn't yet become commonplace in gaming, or were left behind entirely as home consoles and PCs eclipsed the arcades. In this video, we'll go over the games that Ed Logg worked on, and we'll hear from Ed Logg himself, both through my chat with him and through interviews he gave in years prior. This whole project was made possible by Jordan Freeman, the founder of Zoom Platform. Zoom Platform is an online storefront that does direct sales of DRM-free games, meaning you buy the game and you own the game. There's no launcher, no middleman, just a download. Zoom Platform also does a lot of work on game preservation, not only by offering these games for sale on modern hardware, but by supplementing the titles they stock with fixes, updates, and bonus materials. I don't want this to sound like an ad, but I find that Zoom Platform is often overlooked when discussing DRM-free games and game preservation. This video wasn't officially made in partnership with Zoom Platform. There's no paid sponsorship or anything going on here. Jordan Freeman just offered to put me in touch with Ed Logg because he thought it would make for a good interview. I haven't really mentioned this in the past, but it was Jordan Freeman who connected me with people like composer Barry Leach and games journalist Stephen L. Kent. I believe that a big part of video game preservation is preserving the words and stories of the people who make games. And without any stipulations and expecting nothing in return, Jordan Freeman and Zoom Platform have been helping me to document these first-hand accounts of video game history. This video started out as just an interview with Ed Logg, but over the past year, Jordan Freeman has helped to coordinate nearly 20 additional interviews for this project, turning it into a proper career retrospective and celebration of Ed Logg's work. So I want to give a big thank you to Ed Logg for taking time to chat with me. And I want to send a big thank you to Jordan Freeman and everyone at Zoom Platform for doing what you do. I also need to say thank you to all of our channel members and Patreon supporters. Now, with all that said, let's get into the career of Ed Logg.
The truth of the matter is, the evolution of arcade, at least in Atari, came from Ed Logg. Ed Logg took them from being a Pong manufacturer to being able to compete and really legislate what games would look like in the future.
Yeah, I think for me what makes Ed Logg so legendary is any game developer would be lucky to have one genre-defying classics in their repertoire, but he didn't have just one timeless hit, he's had three of them at least. So, you talk about Asteroids, which was obviously one of Atari's biggest machines of all time. He had a Centipede that really broadened the arcade audience, I think, and brought new people into it as well. And then having Gauntlet under his belt as well, which is essentially the blueprint for co-op dungeon crawlers as well. It feels like every one of those games changed the entire direction of the industry in a completely different way.
When I was doing my game design book, I was thinking about, well, hey, what are designers that have really stood the test of time and have had like more than just one hit game? Not to dog on anybody, but a lot of designers have that one game that went really well, and then other games that are also good, but maybe not as good. And it's rare to find someone who, and obviously sequels are different. Like lots of creators will do first one and then the second one and then the third one. And that's hard and impressive too. But I was like, well, who are the designers who've made like the most like really like just masterpiece level games? And so that led me to think about Ed Logg specifically because, he had Asteroids, Centipede, and Gauntlet as just like, and in the space of 5 years or something like that, or close to it, right? Where it was just like, is there a better track record ever, of someone being in video games, that many like just mega hits, stand the test of time. No one will ever forget those games.
Ed's ability to translate his skill from genre to genre, to have created Gauntlet, the home version of San Francisco Rush, and Asteroids and Centipede, to have all of that, it makes him very much a Da Vinci in kind of game designer whose skills just go into all facets of the game.
I think it's interesting that a lot of Ed's games he quote-unquote field tested in his head first. He was actually such a talented designer that he could kind of visualize how a game would play, and he wasn't wrong very often. When he was pretty detached from it. He would just say, well, this didn't work, and move on to something else. But I find it fascinating that he was confident enough in designs and such a great designer that he could picture whether or not it would work, and was right like 90% of the time.
In addition to being a huge fan of Ed's games, I greatly admire his work ethic, deep understanding and love of the craft, and his unwavering dedication to quality. Ed's a pragmatic thinker. He's always coming up with outside-of-the-box solutions. One of the things I learned from him is, while say in the arcades you could add another chip if you needed the extra power, the constraints of game consoles required a whole different logic. And this is from a guy who was able to flourish in both those worlds. And remember, when we're talking his era of game consoles, there were no day one patches or hot fixes. Once games are out the door, you couldn't touch them. Ed's cogency of thought and unique ability to seamlessly adapt to changing market conditions, all while keeping up with the latest tool sets and making sure his craftsmanship never wavered, and maintaining his artistic integrity throughout all that is unbelievably inspiring. If I had to make a comparison to another art form, I'd say Ed's like Bowie meets the Stones. He's always venturing into uncharted, experimental territory, and, he was in the industry when you didn't have established genres. You couldn't go, oh, I'll make a shooting game, I'll make a racing game. He literally just had to go, what kind of game am I going to make? And it's just incredible because, well, he did that at the same time. If there was something other people were doing, like, say, car combat with Rush 2049, that's like Ed's Exile on Main Street. A lot of people may play rock and roll, but it doesn't get better than this. In keeping with the music analogy, it might be best to compare Ed to Eric Clapton. They both have eclectic bodies of work and can play, or in this case build, any style. It's their understanding and appreciation of their roots that I believe enables them to make such moving works. In the case of Clapton, it's his love of blues and country. For Ed, it's his admiration of board and card games.
I always got the sense that Ed was over it. I always got the sense that, and I get this sometimes from the super duper pros in the game industry, like David Jaffe's a little bit like that too. It's like, there's no pageantry about it. It's a grind. It's work. It's art, but it's a lot of sleeve rolling. It's a lot. I mean, what I do know about game development is how much of it is a problem. It's just a freaking broken problem, until somehow they work it out and it happens, But what I think people, and it's our failing in the medium, I've tried the best I could through my career and through the ongoing conversations with game developers to unbridle some of those secrets a little bit, to let people understand a little bit about the drive and the passion and the pride and the effort that it takes to build this stuff. But the industry has never done a really good job at sort of keeping that a consistent through line for us. And so there's a lot of distance from the actual in the trenches work of it that we don't know as consumers of this medium, And I think some of that is by design from the marketing sides of things. I think they just want to have the product and sell the product. And I think also there's, in the case of Ed and other developers that I've met a little bit too, it's like they don't really want to talk about themselves. They don't really want to talk about their secrets and their talents. They want to kind of let the work speak for itself a little bit. And they're, obviously what happened too with games is that it wasn't two people anymore, which is how Ed started, one or two people. It became a lot of people to be able to build these things and get them out there. And Ed saw that whole progression too. So I found him quite enigmatic and a little bit protective, I guess, of his secrets. And maybe he had other interviews where he had felt maybe less revered than I revered him, when I talked with him. And maybe this is just my own, anxieties or whatever, my own issues with being good enough to interview someone that I thought was a giant in the industry. And he was never rude or anything like that. I just felt like I felt like it didn't really matter to him that he was on camera, talking with us. And I think that's also part of what makes him cool too, Like he sure didn't need us, like the guys he was a legend when I met him. He's more of a legend now, as time marches on.
My first introduction to Ed was when I was about 10, 11, 12 years old in Scotland. The local cafe got an Asteroids arcade machine. And to us, this was the future. It was incredible. So we used to take soda bottles back to get the 10 cents back on them so we could go put them in the arcade machine and play them. I never dreamed that I would end up working with a guy,
Obviously, I'm a fanboy. On top of that, I got to tell you, Ultimate History of Video Games, at first all publishers had turned it down. And so I self-published under the name The First Quarter, 25-year history of video games. Real exercise in proving why people with dyslexia shouldn't edit their own books. But GameWorks in Seattle was kind enough to throw a party for me for the launch of the book. And Ed flew in for it, just because he's a nice guy and because we sort of hit it off the first time I spoke with him. And that kind of defines also what kind of a person Ed Logg is.
Ed Logg was hired at Atari in February of 1978. However, his interest in games goes back much further, having played mechanical arcade games in his youth, and having had experience programming games on computers, both at school and at work.
Yes, I attended Berkeley in 66 to 70. And down in the bowling alley, there was a video game. It was a mechanical video game, but, it was a scrolling bombers and you had to shoot them down. And that was my first arcade game, as it were, and I could pretty much play that forever. But I was always into doing other things. And when I worked for Control Data, I was always getting in trouble for doing miscellaneous odds and ends. For example, if you remember the original Adventure, I ported that, but I think that one was in IBM Fortran. I transferred over to Control Data. And there was Star Trek, which was on Control Data, which I ported over to an IBM machine. And my wife worked at Stanford Linear Accelerator at the time, so she was testing the programs at her end. They actually used it to test their Wilbur system out, which is a multiplayer environment, until the government said there are no games allowed on government computers. But, at Control Data, I was doing, I was collecting all sorts of printer pictures, printing calendars. I'd actually put my checker game up on the console of the Control Data 6000 series computers. And I had two of them hooked up to talking to each other. So I was doing all sorts of, funny games, solving 3D tic-tac-toe and things like that, until somebody wrote a paper just as I was about ready to finish it up. But I had an interesting algorithm that, when I play 3D tic-tac-toe, come back and say, you lose in 23 moves, And it's like, oh, good God, how am I going to play against something like that? Well, I actually built my first computer around 77 or so. I went to Stanford University, and I think probably Woz and everybody else was there, but I ordered a video card from some magazine and soldered it myself and built my own home computer, wire wrapped my own motherboard. And I don't know what I had for a TV, but I had a TV and a audio tape connected up to it to save and download programs. And, I don't remember all the details now, but, I did a submarine game on it. I guess not like Depth Charge, or what's it called? Something similar to that. You're shooting ships. So I did that game back in early 77 sometime. And then at one Christmas party I went to, they actually had a prototype of the Atari VCS. And I played some of the VCS games, and I thought that was really keen to actually see it on a home TV. When I was there, when I saw the prototype, that was the first time I'd seen it. I was not aware that they were commercially available, and probably weren't, because it was in a silver box, and I think it was a prototype. Somebody came to the party from Atari and was just hooked it up to the TV. So, that was probably before it was a mass media of any kind. And I was still working at Control Data. Atari was across the street, by the way. And so one of my friends had quit Control Data and gone over to work and suggested I come and do it. And, I was getting tired of what I was doing, so eventually I did that, and I interviewed late 77, and I started work in February of 78. So, for me, it was like, gee, they're actually going to pay me to do video games. How unique.
In addition to computer games, Ed had an appreciation for board games and card games.
Tic-tac-toe, every kid, 3D tic-tac-toe, a lot of board games. I played as a young adult as well, Bill Sorry and all of that stuff too. And I played cards and stuff like that. So, there were a lot of different games I played as a kid and young adult. And then I got into blackjack heavily in the early 70s when Edward Thorpe came out with his stuff. I remember when I first got old enough, I went up to Reno and earned enough money to get my wife an engagement ring, that kind of stuff. And then they kept changing the rules on me. And then later on, I got into video poker machines. And I actually did a video poker machine for a cell phone during a startup. And I went to show the president of the company, we were in Vegas at a conference. And I said, let's go over here. I'll play video poker for you. I've got one machine that I know it's positive return. So I managed to hit Royal Flush. So I won $1,000 that day. And the next night we went out and tried again. I got another Royal Flush. I won $2,000. Next day we went out and hit a bunch of 4 of a kind. So I came out with like just under $3,000 for that trip to go home with.
Because a few of his guys would play poker every now and again, and Ed always plays poker like there's $1 million bet on the hand. So if he, if he has anything good, if he stays in the hand, you need to fold. Yeah, you would always put in a pre-flop raise just to see if Ed had anything good.
When Ed Logg began working at Atari in 1978, one of his first projects was to complete a game called Dirt Bike. This game was designed by Dennis Coble, but at the time, Dennis was moving away from the arcade division and into Atari's home console division. It was during this time that Ed Logg worked on Dirt Bike and Super Breakout simultaneously. While Dirt Bike did have a successful field test, it didn't earn enough to put the game into full production, and was likely shelved in favor of Super Breakout.
I joined and I was asked to take over Dirt Bike, which Dennis Coble had left when he joined Consumer Group from the Coin-Up Group.
I think about Atari's process, and it's interesting how things worked back then. You had an engineer who worked on games, but they didn't all have their own computers early on. There were several women, actually, who would take handwritten pages from engineers and designers and type them out on a digital computer, which had a cross assembler for the 6502 assembly language games. And that's the women would give the designers back a computer printout and a paper tape, and you had to feed the paper tape through the development system into RAM, replacing the ROM, all of these hoops you had to jump through. It wasn't just as simple as hitting compile as it was for later developers. And I always found that interesting, that it was, even though a game had one designer, one engineer, women actually play a huge role in computer science, especially early on in computer science, and they're often not credited for it. So I wanted to bring that up.
And the way you worked back then was you wrote down all the changes to your program on either printer paper or separate piece of paper, submitted it to some gals who were entering it into a PDP machine, and they give you out a fresh paper tape, which the program on it, and a fresh listing. And so you'd feed the paper tape through and do your debugging, update, and repeat. So there's a lag between the time you submit your paperwork and the time you get it back. And that was the one time, Super Breakout came in ideas. Oh, I'll tell you what, I'll just pop out the EPROMs, art EPROMs, and put in Super Breakout EPROMs, art EPROMs, and ping pong back and forth between the two games. But that was the only time I did that. Okay. Because there was a lag. Later on, of course, you were entering your own data in, and there was no lag time.
In 1978, Atari released Super Breakout into arcades, the first officially published game worked on by Ed Logg.
Each of the games had its own influence. For example, my Super Breakout, my first video game, came from Breakout, of course. And that came out from a conversation at lunch where Owen Rubin said, Nolan Bushnell will talk to me, and we talked about doing a update of Breakout. And I said, oh, I could do that. And so I came up with 6 different variations of Breakout, of which only 3 made it out in the coin-operated game. And it's an interesting story because when I first started doing it, I did Super Breakout, and I'd go home and I'd dream Super Breakout all night long. And it's kind of bizarre. Wake up in the morning, I just played Super Breakout for 8 hours in my mind, that kind of thing. And later on, that wore off after the years went by. But, for the first few years, I'd go home and just play that game in my mind over and over all night long. Asteroids the same way, playing Asteroids over and over.
This game is a follow-up to the 1976 game Breakout. It offers 3 different gameplay modes, which can be selected with this knob. There is a single button used to serve the ball, and a rotary dial that controls the paddle at the bottom of the screen. Much like the original game, the goal here is to bounce this ball against these bricks to break them down. The 3 different game modes are Double, which gives players 2 paddles and 2 balls, Cavity, which starts you off with 1 ball but allows you to eventually unleash 2 more, and Progressive, in which the wall of bricks moves down toward the player, increasing in speed as the game goes on.
Outside of Tetris, I don't know that there's a more snackable game that I could go, I got 5 minutes, I'm going to play this. And then I end up losing 2 hours, then Super Breakout. It's one of those early, home games where I just couldn't get enough of it. It's sort of like Pong meets Prison Break, I guess. In some ways. Even just thinking about it right now makes me want to go and play it again. And I think it really calls to something that not like, oh, games are bad nowadays, because games are insane nowadays, but that games used to be able to live on one simple compulsive loop, right? Super Breakout's really simple, right? You have a paddle, you're hitting a ball, you're just trying to knock out blocks, right? It has slightly more complexity as you play than that, but that is enough to engage you for like hours, right? And to be a game that you can pick up right now and instantly understand how to play. And there's something beautiful about that. And that's one of the kind of nice things about Ed's career, is that he lived in this world that, moved between, home PC and console and arcades. And arcades obviously had to have that short, gripping, easy to understand thing. So he just got to work on a bunch of games that had this old school style of how you get somebody interested that still is relevant today. My kids love playing all kinds of complex, crazy games when they're young, but like if I handed them Super Breakout, they play for an hour and be screaming with joy. And so it is a like a lot of Ed's games, I think it has a timeless quality to it.
Super Breakout for me really stands out there as one of Ed's kind of early technical marvels. Obviously, Breakout, a really important title for Atari, having that legacy of Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs having worked on it when they were at Atari. And I think the way that Ed kind of developed that aspect of Breakout into something completely different, and really making it feel like a brand new game without too much different hardware there, having stuff like double cavity in the progressive modes in there as well. Even stuff like, the fact that Ed, he didn't invent the genre of the game, but he really evolved it as well. So I think a lot of companies now kind of look at their biggest hits and kind of build on what already works. But, Ed was already doing that in the late 70s. So I think he really added to the concept of Breakout and really made players want to just feed more coins into this new super enhanced version of it.
They wanted to do my Super Breakout in cart, which is ideal for the VCS. And the coin-op had this wonderful program where at the end we could buy the prototypes, like $50, you buy the prototype, take it home. So I bought the Super Breakout prototype. It's a black and white monitor with a color overlay, but the consumer wanted it. So I said, hey, take it upstairs. You can play it all you want. You can get used to it. And I took it upstairs, and then about a year later, I said, I want that game for my home. So I went up Friday and I couldn't find anybody. So, I got the hand truck, hauled it down to the truck, took it home. We come back next Monday and I found out the police were called because somebody stole their game. And I explained to him, no, it's mine. No, it's ours. No, it's mine. No, it's ours. It was up here for you. It's mine. I bought it. So.
Super Breakout wound up being a success for Ed and Atari. The next game that he worked on for the company was Video Pinball. The game is exactly what it sounds like, a video game version of pinball. According to Ed, it simulated pinball by using a half-silvered mirror with a monitor below the mirror and the graphics for the playfield above the monitor. The monitor would show the flippers and ball, which gave the impression the white ball was on the playfield. The playfield actually had LEDs controlled by the program, which simulated lit targets. In addition, the control panel was hinged, which allowed the player to nudge the cabinet to give the ball some English.
And I think, pinball is one of those genres where it is actually really difficult to make a decent video game based around pinball. I remember, it wasn't really until it got to the 90s when I felt that you could do it on a home machine, with games like Pinball Fantasies and Slam Tilt on the Amiga was one of my favorites back then. But I think a big part of it was having the physics, so that had to feel right. But when he did Video Pinball in 1979, the way he achieved that pinball feel was by basically making a hybrid machine. So using that clever kind of mirror overlay system that projected onto a real 3D playfield under glass. It looked like it was a physical table. I remember, reading at the time that, a lot of people in the industry were stunned how Atari did that, and it kind of really summed up the innovation that Atari's arcade R&D lab and the experimentation that they were willing to do at the time as well, and understands that, not only did Ed understand storytelling, but also using hardware trickery and, using these innovations to really bridge the gap between something physical like pinball and video gaming. So it's, you can almost think of it as something like augmented reality, like, 30 years before we'd ever even heard of that. So yeah, I think that was really innovative.
Ed was admittedly skeptical about the concept when he was tasked with working on the game. Would players really want to play video pinball when real pinball machines were available? Well, yes. The game wound up being a commercial success for Atari. Later, in 1979, Ed helped out with Atari Football 2 and Atari 4-player football. That was also the year that he programmed Asteroids, a game that has long been considered one of the greatest ever made.
So, thinking of the catalog of games that Ed Logg has made, a lot of them have had a lot of impact on me, and one of them being Asteroids was pretty much the start of my love for arcade games. And I remember it was the first game I ever saw outside of my house, and it just had such a huge impact. So the design and everything just kind of captivated me and got me so into gaming. It was just such an incredible thing to see in an arcade game.
For me, that is one of those games, even though I've always been terrible at Asteroids. I mean, I think last time I played the arcade cabinet was at an expo here probably about 5 years ago. I lasted about 20 seconds. I've always been dreadful at Asteroids. But to me, that is one of those machines that just defines the golden age of arcades. And even now, I think, you look at it, there's something really otherworldly about those incredible vector graphics on that game with, the kind of razor sharp edges and the way it glows. And it's got a really distinct aesthetic, that game as well. And the reason I'm probably so bad at that game is because of stuff like, the UFO edition that forces the player to move around. So I did hear that Ed absolutely hated people camping in video games. So you wanted the player to actively move around and not just find a spot on the screen. Even though I do know there is a certain place that you can go on Asteroids, I have heard in more recent years, where you can actually, score massively just by sitting in one corner of the screen. But that was something that Ed actively didn't want people to do.
I adored Asteroids. The Jaws soundtrack was such a freaking amazing thing to hear, emanating at the back of the arcade. Boom, 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 boom. And it was so difficult and so compelling and so cool looking. All those vector-based games back then were just so cool. They stood out against the raster stuff in such a big way. And Asteroids was very, very special, very unique.
One thing to me was when you'd get hit on it and your shit would explode into pieces. I think that was a absolutely beautiful little touch at the end, where you're seeing the kind of vector engine and the vector graphics fall apart because you've been hit by a rock. I think that's great.
Seeing it and seeing how beautiful those vector graphics were, and just how bright those lines. There was something magical about how those still to this day, vector graphics. If I see a vector game, I just lose my mind. They're so beautiful, so stark. And Asteroids, having that sort of, growing up and learning more about, the history of video games and, Space War and all of that, and learning more about all of these, just how good Asteroids is of a game. And I know it's standing on the shoulder of giants, but just how incredibly well it serves the audience, because it's super difficult, but it's instantly grokkable. You would look at it and you know what you're supposed to do, which is survive. You just survive. Things come at you, shoot them. If you can control the spaceship, you're doing great.
I remember Asteroids, it was all right, the dopest thing to do is for Asteroids was to push turbo, push the rocket button, and see how many times you can fly through the mud. Oh yeah!
Before you get nailed.
Oh, here go the little ship. I got the little ship, man. Yeah, I'm good.
And the sound, that was what was captivating. Just even in the track mode, it would just sit there and just do. You know, I'd be like, what's that? What's making noise in the corner? It just drew you into it. And of course, it speeds up as you play the game, which just makes you more nervous and screw up. It's perfect. The simplest game design. It's just so well done. Yeah, and for Ed, this was probably 3 months of his life in 1978. He probably sat down, banged it out, and went on to the next one. But he doesn't realize how important it was or influential it was to everybody else.
The origin of Asteroids has been told many times over. Basically, Atari had a prototype game where players operated a ship in outer space. The game featured a large, indestructible asteroid that players would shoot at to no effect. The concept was adapted into what would become Asteroids. This feels like as good of a time as any to talk more about the contrast between the original arcade versions of these games and their seemingly infinite number of home console ports. Personally, I had never played or even seen an Asteroids cabinet in an arcade until just a few years ago. But for as far back as I can remember, I knew that Asteroids was widely regarded as a very important game. I played various versions of Asteroids, and I understood that it was a major influence on many games that came after it. It's often credited as being the first arcade game to allow players to enter their initials on a leaderboard after achieving a high score. However, the real power of the game was totally lost on me before playing the arcade version on an actual original Asteroids cabinet. The footage you're seeing here is from Midway Presents Arcade's Greatest Hits, the Atari Collection 1, a PlayStation disc that was developed by Digital Eclipse. This collection claims that it allows you to play the games exactly as they were in the arcade. But having actually played these games in an arcade, I can assure you that they are entirely different experiences. In almost any home version of Asteroids, you can expect to see very minimal graphics. There's a black background representing outer space, a triangle to represent your ship, and of course there are the titular asteroids. These simple graphics are what you might expect from a game made in the late 1970s, but seeing them on an actual Asteroids cabinet is so much more impactful than what I've seen from any home versions. That's because the arcade version of Asteroids uses vector graphics. There are other people out there, including Ed Logg himself, who have gone into a lot of the fine details behind this technology. But to put it very simply, vector graphics don't use pixels. Instead, they use a series of coordinates connected by lines, and since there aren't any pixels, they look super sharp and can be scaled up without becoming distorted.
The vectors on CRTs is something that kids have been really missing these days. When you look at it, it just stands out so strongly, and I've not really seen anything that it's kind of like looking at fire. As a human, you've got that kind of draw to it, and when you see something amazing and beautiful like that, the brightness and the intensity of it, it just glows. And I absolutely love that kind of vector engine and look of the Atari vector games.
The very minimalist vector graphics look of it was so bright on the screen in an arcade coin-op. It's just really so stands out, but just so minimalist. Like, I didn't wish they were fancier. I didn't wish the ships were like 3D models in Asteroids or something. I was like, no, this gives you all the information you need. And there's like an elegance to the design of it, which is deceptive. You might say like, oh, well, there are no graphics in that game. No, there are. They just made very specific choices. And then, getting to talk to Ed years later about why those choices were made, and obviously learning about technical limitations that led to different things. It's like guided a lot of those choices, but still ended up with something that just looks so perfect and doesn't look like, oh, they were really limited by the tech. It's like, no, they used the tech they had perfectly to make this perfect thing.
The first time that I saw an Asteroids cabinet, I was immediately struck by the resolution of the screen, which is 1024 by 768. For comparison, the PlayStation 1 has an output resolution of 320 by 240.
And it's high resolution. Yeah. And that's what makes it really stand out.
The vector display on an Asteroids cabinet allows for different objects to be lit differently, so things like projectiles have a mesmerizing glow around them, which is caused by phosphor decay. That's an effect which can occur on televisions as well, but I've never really seen it faithfully duplicated in any of the home versions of Asteroids. The other major element missing from the home versions of these arcade games is how they control. For instance, while Super Breakout has had a bunch of ports over the years, the original game was designed to work with a very specific control scheme, that being rotary controls. On the Atari 2600, you could control the game with a paddle, which was a lot closer to the arcade experience than the joystick controls used on the Atari 5200 port. My introduction to Super Breakout was the 2600 version. When I played later ports on the Game Boy, PC, and elsewhere, the entire experience felt heavily altered. Using a dial or a paddle gives the gameplay a really smooth, tactile feeling. Using a directional pad, like I am here while emulating the PlayStation port, I feel confined to these jerky, stilted movements where I have to kind of stab in one direction or another. It's not unplayable, but it's not at all like the original arcade experience.
That was a touchy subject. I do a game and the consumer come along and do the game, and it's like, come on, guys, I can give you the source code. Why are you trying to invent a new game? Just, writing something from scratch where you can take the original source code and do it, Centipede, Asteroids, in those early games. And so finally I said, look, come on, let me review it. I can give you feedback on it. And so they have finally allowed us to do that. And there was also an issue because Atari had this wonderful program of a bonus plan for coin-op engineers for if you sold a game that did very well, they would pay you a bonus. And we actually talked them into doing a bonus for the consumer cards too, because really it was our game. And so, that eventually came about too.
When you play these home ports, you're getting an adaptation that is forced to omit some of the defining characteristics that made these games successful in the first place.
It's like when you're playing a light gun game with a controller. The game's still good, the design's great, but it's just not as visceral as it was intended.
Often, the core game design is strong enough for these titles to be translated to a different control scheme or visual style and still be fun to play. But when it comes to game preservation, or even just trying to really understand what it was that made these games so popular when they were first released, I believe that you need to play them on something as close to the original arcade hardware as possible.
Centipede, I needed a trackball because I wanted variable speed. You want to go real fast at times, real slow at times. So you need something has both that, and a trackball works, whereas a joystick does not. And you can't believe the amount of pressure that marketing puts on design team to say, no, go use a joystick. People are used to joysticks and stuff. And it's like, no.
The games can still be enjoyed in other forms, but imagine trying to explain the appeal and success of Wii Sports or Guitar Hero to someone who could only experience the games using a regular gamepad. There's something very physical about a lot of these older arcade games that just can't be directly translated in most home versions.
And it was interesting when I got to talk to Ed for the book interview, him just talking about it in just very commercial terms, of like, well, why did you make these choices? Well, to make more money, and it was like, and I would talk to, because he did all these other games too, like, and back then it was brutal. Like, you would make a game and they would put it out to test, right? And it wouldn't maybe have the cabinet art done yet or something. It would just be the game. They'd put it in one of these arcades where they would test games, and people would just go up to play it. And then they would decide based on the coin box whether to keep making those or not. So you'd make the whole game for whatever, 6 months or longer, and put it out to test. And if people didn't play it, it would just disappear. Like, it wouldn't go into production, because the cost of goods, probably the wrong term, but the cost to manufacture these cabinets was so high that you're not going to manufacture ones that aren't testing well, right? So then you get these, there are cases where, like, oh, here's the test cabinet that survived all these years of, like, his Roadrunner Laserdisc game or something like that. that, you know, has the extra trouble of the Laserdisc not lasting that long. But when I talked to him about it, I was like, "Oh, weren't you bummed that these games never got out?" And he's like, "No, they didn't test well, so they had to go." You know, he was just very brutal about it, and just like, "Oh, that's what we did. If it wasn't doing well, try the next one. Don't keep making that one." You know.
I think one of my favorite anecdotes about Atari is they used to do these field tests. A lot of coin-op companies would do this, and it was really exciting for the engineers and the art teams. And obviously, back then, there weren't even a lot of teams. Sometimes the engineers would do everything themselves. But at this time, Atari was starting to hire some artists. But design and engineering were usually done by the same person. In this case, Ed Logg, he field tested Dirt Bike, and it earned enough money to make it good enough to say, "Oh, you know, this is maybe we have something here," but it wasn't good enough to make it into production. And that's something about Ed he was never afraid to do. He was never afraid to kill his darlings. You know, you have to look at something and say, well, this is good, but not great, and maybe move on to something else. And in fact, he was working on Super Breakout at the time, which was his first commercial hit. And that's definitely a good choice that he went with that one there.
There are different inspirations for most of my games. Let me just go through some of them and just give you some idea. Yes, there are influences. For example, the ships in Asteroids came from Space War. And I'd played Space War up at the Stanford Linear Accelerator in 1971. And I think down in the Stanford Forum, it was actually coin operated down in the Stanford Forum. You had 2 PDP machines. You put a quarter in, you played Space War. So there's some influences from that game. Asteroids came about because of the famous story about, Lyle Raines called me into his office and said, "Hey, we had this game Cosmos or something, and people kept shooting this big asteroid, and they were expecting something to happen. Can you shoot asteroids and break them up?" And I said, "Yeah, I can do that." And he wanted to do it on raster, and I wanted to do it on XY because you have much better resolution. And it turns out there's other good things about it because XY has really blacks instead of raster screens, which raster screens at that point were 320 by 240, and XY were 10 something by 768, 1024 by 768. So much better resolution. You could do things much better on it, especially for a space game, which was mostly black anyway.
Asteroids was a huge success, and it wouldn't be too long before Ed helped to bring another wildly successful Atari game to arcades. 1981's Centipede was created by a team of 4, which included a technician, an engineer, and 2 programmers. Those programmers being Ed Logg and Donna Bailey. Beyond being a widely loved video game, Centipede is notable for several reasons. According to a 1982 issue of the trade magazine Cashbox, it was tied for 3rd place with Donkey Kong as the highest earning arcade game of that year, with Pac-Man at number 2 and Miss Pac-Man leading the pack. Centipede is also the only published game worked on by Donna Bailey, who is regarded as one of the pioneering women in the video game industry. When she was hired at Atari in 1980, she was the only woman working in their arcade division. At that time, programmers at Atari had access to a collection of game concepts that were developed through brainstorming sessions. Centipede was developed from a very simply worded concept.
There was one idea described in one sentence as a multi-segmented insect crawls onto the screen and is shot by the player.
The original Centipede game was from a brainstorming idea called Bug Shooter. And other than shooting bugs, that's really all I had in mind. I was not going to go through any elaborate storyline about your often never world and it's inhabited with a bunch of bugs, and if you shoot them all and then you get the princess back or anything.
The arcade version of Centipede is played with a trackball, allowing for smooth movement and a sort of frantic physical interaction with the game that is much more physically demanding than most of the home versions of Centipede. The actual gameplay is very true to that original brainstorming concept. Players move along the bottom of the screen and shoot at the multi-segmented Centipede as it steadily approaches the player.
To see Centipede just arrive and think, oh my, what, you're a bug? You play a bug in this freaking game? And then you walk up and you got a trackball and It's an incredible experience, and it's so hypnotic and so, masterfully envisioned and fun. All of these ingredients, these magical Atari ingredients.
So Centipede was one that, again, it was in every single arcade, and the artwork to the cabinet was just outstanding. And it was one of those where it was colorful and had, it just drew me in. And I remember being so bad at it the first time I played it. And it was one of those where it was an incredibly difficult game. And it really wasn't, it was one that I'd always play when I saw it, but it wasn't really until I saw somebody who was really good at it, by the name of Duke Dang, who really made me want to get good at that game and learn the subtleties of trackball games. And it's one of those where a lot of people find it to be incredibly hard, but if you grind on it and kind of get a better understanding of it, it's so good. Lining up the mushrooms and getting everything to just where you're not putting yourself in a bad position. It's one of those classics that's just really made players get better, because you didn't want to be walking away in 10 seconds. You wanted to stay there. So it was about getting the finesse of using that trackball. Just such an incredibly designed game.
And the trackball was interesting too. I'm glad you mentioned that. If you did start going too intensely and you weren't careful, your skin was going to get pinched. You get that little pinch, you'd be like, God. And then at that point, it's over. Which happened to me on more than one occasion. Getting it caught right in between the ball and the edge if it wasn't maintained right.
It was a game that I think it was kind of like a wolf in sheep's clothing. As you look at it, it looks like quite a gentle, pleasant, cutesy kind of game with the mushrooms and stuff on there and the spiders and stuff like that, even though it kind of seemed maybe more friendly if you saw that cabinet in the arcade. But again, a real brutal game when you got into it. And I did hear that apparently Centipede, it was obviously working with Donna, one of the aims was to make it appeal to a much broader audience than some previous Atari titles, and I heard that it was actually very popular with female players in the arcade as well. I think maybe due to the vibrancy of it and the colors, and maybe seeming a bit more friendly than like a vector-based space shooter. So I think that game though, but don't be deceived by Centipede. It's not quite as cutesy and easy as it looks. It's a really tough game underneath there.
Second floor bowling alley, which to me to this day seems crazy, because it's like, what are you going to do on the first floor if you have a bowling alley directly above you? But a second floor bowling alley, I think it was called Lafayette Lanes, and you'd go up there and they had one arcade machine, and that one arcade machine was Centipede. And the best thing about that Centipede machine was that it was some enterprising young man, and it wasn't me. I promise it wasn't me. Had hacked that machine a little bit. If you knew what to do, you could kind of get infinite games, and that was sick. So I played a lot of Centipede on there, more than I played Candlepin Bowling, which is good because I think Centipede ended up serving me better.
I know that I look like I'm only 20, but I'm very old. And so Centipede I know very well from actually the arcades. And that was one of the earliest games that you would like beeline to at the arcade. So it's sort of the great thing about Centipede is it took the principles of Space Invader, which is kind of one of the most well-known original arcade classics, and it added an element to it, which is, turning the Centipede and making the 100 section of it be this thing that can bounce off of stuff. And so instead of, a Space Invader has this very methodical as they're moving, but at any moment, if the Centipede hits something else, suddenly it's switching direction. And so it just added one little thing that suddenly took, what we knew from Space Invader and, multiplied it by times 10. I mean, it really, I know it seems like overinflating it, but for the time that we were in at that time, this is not different from going from GTA 2 and like this top-down sort of like open map game to an actual 3D open world game. It really was a very similar idea to Space Invader, but had just enough to it that you're like, oh, that changed things. And Space Invader is a type of game that it was amazing because you didn't really get to play video games until then at your home. But like Centipede, Space Invader never like held my attention, even as a novel thing. Centipede is one of those things that really holds you.
Centipede was extremely popular, so much so that an Italian company attempted to release a copycat game called Magic Worm. The game had obvious similarities to Centipede, but Ed Logg was able to prove that the game was outright theft. Centipede included secret code that could only be accessed under certain conditions. Data from the game could be translated into Morse code to relay the message, "Copyright 1980 Atari." As was detailed in an affidavit from Ed Logg, Ed was able to find this secret message in a PCB board from a Magic Worm machine, which gave conclusive evidence that the game was essentially a bootleg of Atari's Centipede. Centipede would be followed up in arcades with 1982's Millipede, but before that, Ed programmed Othello for the Atari 2600, an adaptation of the classic board game.
Yeah, Othello is another interesting game because I was trying to say, can I just do a pattern matching game? Just have a bunch of patterns and play the game with patterns. And for a real primitive game with no look ahead, yes, I guess you could do it. And that's what I did my Othello on. It was simply a pattern matching game and no thinking, so there was no screen blanking on that.
Yeah, I think another one that for me showed Ed's kind of versatility was, and a game that most people might not think of when you think of Ed Logg's titles, was the Atari 2600 version of Othello, which, I like Othello anyway as a board game, but the fact that obviously this was a home console strategy port, and, he squeezed all of this. He and Carol Shaw built this game into 128 bytes of RAM. It's not megabytes, not kilobytes, bytes. And the fact that they built a fully functional AI opponent, essentially, into that game. And we've kind of talked before about how Ed's kind of got that computer science, engineering, and academic background in there as well. I think it showed that he really understood the algorithmic side of games as well. He wasn't just doing kind of reflex-based shooters. He understood logic as well. So I think that's probably what made Ed's games so good. Having that analytical side also made his arcade games good as well, but I think that really came across in his home port of Othello.
The graphics for Othello were done by Carol Shaw, the programmer behind River Raid and another early female presence in the games industry. Millipede plays similarly to its predecessor, but includes several enhancements and new elements.
It's basically the follow-up game. It's everything that Centipede had and more. Just a little more refining and fine-tuning. The cabinet itself, love the artwork on it, but so different. It seems less aggressive than the original Centipede, and a little more... There's more going on in the cabinet artwork, which it showed through in the game itself. But foundationally, there's so many similarities. It's just kind of like Centipede to the next level.
I think Millipede as well, that kind of, going back to what I said with Super Breakout, using the same hardware and pushing it even harder and developing on an earlier game and really making that game into a whole new dimension, really. I think you look at Millipede, again, more enemies, you have more chaos on there, stuff like the bees and the earwigs and the DDT bombs and the scrolling levels that were in there too. I think obviously it keeps the trackball controls as well, but it really kind of turns that up a notch or two in that game. I think I did hear from research that a lot of players, when they're doing the field tests on Millipede, complained that it was a bit too fast to nicely control, but I think that was one thing that Ed was never afraid of doing. He wanted players to maybe start as a casual, but he always wanted you to kind of chase that skill ceiling, as it were. And I think the closest thing we compare it today to hardcore gamers that chase stuff like bullet hell games. Well, I think Millipede was doing that back in 1982. So again, that was a case of Ed just taking something that he'd already done before. And even on the same hardware and just pushing it harder into a new dimension.
When I was learning to play Centipede, it didn't take long to jump over to Millipede. And same thing, it just absolutely love the game. It's one that the same Centipede player, Duke Dang, just incredibly good at it. And it's just watching a good Centipede player, a good Millipede player, it's just one of those games that watching it being played at a high level is just an amazing thing to witness.
In Centipede, the player character was sometimes referred to as the Bug Blaster.
Originally, it was supposed to be the Atari insignia, which is the two things and the bow in the middle. And the lawyers came back and said, "Up, looks too much like the Atari logo, and the fact that you shoot that center thing out, that kills our trademark. Can't do that." Okay, so I changed it a little bit.
But in Millipede, players take control of the Archer. The game has a surprisingly in-depth backstory compared to Centipede, which didn't really have any backstory at all. According to a flyer for the game, there once lived a youth of royal lineage who had a deep love for nature. This youth was in line to be king, but when his father was dying and attempting to pass the throne onto his son, the youth rejected the position, stating, "I will protect the realm with all my body and soul, father, but I will never rule its living creatures, be they beast or human." With his final breath, the king cursed his son. The son then addressed the people of the kingdom and told them that they had been freed. He also asked that they refer to him as Archer. Just then, from beyond the grave, the former king began to retaliate against his rebellious son. Everything that wasn't human had grown to sizes beyond belief. Under the spell of the deceased king, enormous insects began to attack the kingdom, led by a mighty Millipede. Staying true to his word, the son was forced to take up his bow against the very nature that he had been so in love with. When I first read this backstory, I wondered if Ed had anything to do with it, but after a bit more digging, I came to the conclusion that it was likely the work of a marketing division. In a previously mentioned interview with Richard Rouse III, Ed gave some insights into his views on stories in games, stating, "I have never been high on stories. I feel it is absolutely necessary to have the player grasp the theme, setting, ambience, and goals. Sometimes stories help to make the goals easier to understand. Some games are made like a movie, so a story makes good sense. The player feels he is the main character that he is controlling. In a coin-op game, a story makes no sense unless it is shown in the attract mode. We do not want the player wasting his time watching something when he could be playing or putting in more money." Like Centipede, Millipede was a top-ranking earner for Atari. This streak of successful games would continue with 1985's Gauntlet. Production on Gauntlet started in 1983. Originally, the project was being worked on under the name Dungeons. Early into development, Robin Ziegler, who was the original hardware engineer on the game, was laid off. Atari didn't have another hardware engineer to put on the project at that time, so Ed Logg began work on a video disc game called Roadrunner. A different version of this game would be completed by another team and released in 1985. That version of the game used computer graphics, but Ed's version of Roadrunner had backgrounds and animated cutscenes that were read from the video disc. Ed's version of Roadrunner did well during field tests, but before going into production, Atari decided to cancel the video disc idea. When asked by Atari to switch the game to traditional computer graphics, Ed refused and instead chose to pick back up where he left off on Gauntlet. While the video disc version of Roadrunner never went into full production, a prototype cabinet has been displayed at some conventions. By all accounts, Ed Logg never had an issue dropping a game if he didn't feel it was the right project to be working on, and he always had a keen intuition for whether or not a game would be worth producing.
One of the things I love about him is he's very pragmatic. I remember in the early 90s when graphics were starting to come into their own, suggesting that it would be really cool to remake Asteroids with a chrome finish on the spaceship so that you're always seeing the reflections of the stars and things as they're going by. And he listened to it and said, I could create it in a day and it wouldn't be it would be cheap to make, but no one would play it. Just saw it, ran it through it past his Razor version of the Razor, and then said, no, it's it'd be easy to do, but there's no market for it.
It is, as a creative person, it's so hard to let go of something you think is good that isn't working yet, and you maybe know it's not working, but you're like, well, what if we change this and that and the other thing? And there's something, back then it was possible at least to spend a relatively small budget to make the whole game, right? So you would at least get to make the whole game. Now you start a prototype of something and you spend 1,000 times the budget of Asteroids on it or something like that, and then you've got just a prototype, and then you decide, well, do we spend 1,000,000 times the budget of Asteroids to make the rest of it, and then maybe you have something, but it's like, oh, what is it right yet? Let's keep going. And even games that ship now and don't connect at launch sometimes get creators hang on and try to make them better. And I would say statistically, most of the time it doesn't change things, but there are exceptions to that, right? Where a game goes from a flop to a success, but usually where there's some core of something people really like, and it's like technical problems or it's balance problems or whatever. But it was interesting to think of were there games of his or any of those coin-op creators that, well, it was just the balance was off and that's why no one wanted to play it, and if they had tuned it a little bit, could it have become the next Centipede or something like that? But no, it was like he talked about it as if, well, I made the best version I could, and that didn't connect, over these 2 weekends of testing or whatever it was. And so on to the next one. No use wasting my time on that thing that is not working. And that's probably the smart move, because if it's if you have the budget to go make a new one, just start doing that as soon as possible. Don't get into some sunk cost fallacy sort of situation. So yeah, it was just, I remember doing that interview, as a much younger game developer, who had only shipped a few games when I did that interview, and just being struck by his practicality so much, because you talk so much about art and creativity and doing great things with their games, and he was like, nope, didn't work. On to the next.
A lot of people treat their game as their baby, and they have this vision and they're gonna shove it out. I have a vision when I start my game too, but once I get into it and realize this is not working, I play it, it's not fun. I can't see people coming back to it, and it's like, why waste my time? And so I had this philosophy for about every other one of my games was working. It was a hit. So I do a hit game and I start something crap, this is not working, and go do something else. In the case of Gauntlet, for example, I was doing Roadrunner, and it was on a laser disc, and in between killing the coyote, you'd flash to a cartoon of Chuck Jones' drawn cartoon of coyote being killed the appropriate way. And laser disc, it earned enough in field tests to where the point where they didn't want to kill it, but they didn't think they could sell a video disc game, so they wanted to convert it over to System 1, which is a standard raster game with no cartoons. And at that point I said, no, I don't think it's going to work. And besides, I have this better idea, which was Gauntlet. So I went off and did Gauntlet. So yeah, I didn't finish Roadrunner, but I did go off and do Gauntlet.
Gauntlet is a fast-paced hack-and-slash game that sees up to 4 players simultaneously battle their way through a series of mazes.
You're egging your body, to go get, go kill that generator. While I go do this, grab the key or open the door or whatever. And so there's the cooperative, competitive nature, which is always want in the game too. You want to get as much resources, but without pissing off the other guys, kind of thing.
Players can choose from Thor the warrior, Questor the elf, Tyra the Valkyrie, or Merlin the wizard. Each of the 4 available characters have different strengths and weaknesses.
Gauntlet was such a game changer to gaming. It was this big adventure. Like you didn't know how long the game was going to be. It gave you a lot of variety as far as the different characters. Like some players that I knew, they had to play the elf or the warrior. Like it was kind of like that's their character. And it was just a different way of gaming. It didn't really have bosses or anything. It just you just kept going and going and going. And it was the fact that it was 4-player. It was like it was one of those first few times you could have so many players on a cabinet at once. And it just had that Dungeons and Dragons feel to it. And it did so many different things, like you can gain more health, and it had a little bit of problem solving going on to it too, because you had to navigate having keys and getting out of the maze. So the labyrinth.
Gauntlet and Gauntlet II, from my pocketbook standpoint, liking those less because they had all the continue and they just wanted to gobble your quarters. And I would have friends who would be willing to put in more money than I would because I was very thrifty about these things. And I liked that in, Centipede or Asteroids, you could really play forever on 1 quarter if you had the skill. Whereas Gauntlet, it felt like, maybe if you're super, super, super good, but really you should put in another quarter at this point. But that loving there, I don't know if I remember playing a multiplayer game like that before that game of just like the way there's the 4 slots on the thing, genius move to like say, 4 people can put in money at once. Great idea. And just like the voice in that game, I remember thinking was great, getting so much out of just a few lines, right? And so iconic, Red Warrior needs food badly or whatever. The sound when death is coming, all that stuff is like, this is super well done.
I loved Gauntlet as well, but it was a quarter sucker, man. And it was a lot to take on alone when the home version started to come, but brilliant and super fun. And I think one of the cool things about those classic games is that your mind did the interpolation. Your mind was what put the story and the art together around the experience. Like you saw the sprites and these simplistic images, but you embellished everything in your head, and you could get lost in it, and you'd be playing it when you weren't playing it in your mind. And then the amazing stuff started to happen with the box art, which was always so freaking inspiring. It's so good. The classic, especially on the 2600, what a dream. Yeah, like you lusted for those freaking things, and then you'd plug them in and they were like so not the art that had been sold to you. But it was still so cool, like the whole thing. It was so, and Tron came out right around then too, like the movie, and it was all just like this puzzle clicking into place, like video games were real. They were here. This was never going to go away. They were just going to get cooler and cooler and more significant, more powerful. And so Ed was like hitting homers, man, again and again and again. And I just loved all of those games.
Well, not the first multiplayer game. Gauntlet is documented as the first arcade game to support 4 simultaneous players who could drop in or out of the action at any time during a game, without having to wait for a new session to begin. 4-player games would become much more common in arcades, but at the time, it was a largely untested concept, and Ed had to fight for it.
I had a really hard time with marketing, trying to convince them that, yes, well, first of all, I had a hard time convincing marketing to get 4 people around a game. I had a hard time convincing the operators, I have no plexiglass protecting you from the monitor screen. And it was done intentionally because I didn't want glare off the plexiglass that we usually put there. The overhead lights would cause glare and create blind spots for you. You don't want that playing the game. And so I had a metal bezel for the first time. I had no plexiglass. As I said, this game had so many unique factors. And we had to convince operators, you drop ball bearings on the monitor to show them it wouldn't break. That's the standard monitor test. And you try to convince them that no, they're not going to break the monitor. You know, they're not going to break into the game. They got the metal bezel there, and you got 4 people around a cabinet. Marketing said you can't do that, but I designed a cabinet, took it out to field test, and I proved to them by example that yes, you can do it.
Another game came out a little while after that, or a few years after that, but without a doubt owes a massive debt of gratitude to Gauntlet. Was the X-Men game, like X-Men Arcade, with that same sort of like, let's see how many people we can get standing around a machine, how many controllers can we get on there, choosing your character and everything like that, working in tandem. Yeah, there's so much about it that other games ended up having to emulate because it is so groundbreaking. So groundbreaking.
They just didn't think it would work. I said, yes, you can do it. It takes a little extra room because the 2 side people are taking up room where another cabinet could be squished up against it. But it would work. It'll work.
Eventually, both Gauntlet and its sequel, Gauntlet II, were offered as 2-player cabinets as well. Throughout the game, players will hear the voice of the Dungeon Master, who will comment on various aspects of the game, provide hints, and sometimes taunt players.
Warrior, I've eaten all the food lately.
But like Gauntlet had speech, and it's like, and you're like, what is this? What's going on? This is like the future.
I don't think I ever remember seeing an arcade actually talking to me. I know obviously in the coming years there's always like fight and finish him and Mortal Kombat and all that kind of, it was part of the parcel. But I do think for me, just another vivid memory of playing Gauntlet on the arcades is hearing speech coming out the cabinet, which I think was quite rare back then. So it had another layer for 100% for me.
That's kind of egg on. It's getting the Dungeon Master in to point out to people, hey, somebody's being a hog here. You gotta do something about it.
The Dungeon Master was voiced by Ernie Facilius, who created the famous 1978 Star Wars parody, Hardware Wars. According to Ed's 2012 GDC postmortem on the game, Gauntlet was the result of trying to adapt Dungeons & Dragons into a video game. Ed had been turning the idea over in his head for some time when he finally saw a solution in the 1983 game Dandy. Dandy was programmed by John Palovich. The project began as his college thesis, and the game was co-designed with his friend Joel Gluck. Originally titled Thesis of Terror, the game was eventually renamed to Dandy, which is a play on D&D. The game is a top-down dungeon crawler, where players shoot at enemies and collect keys to advance through a series of 26 levels, labeled A through Z. Even in its earliest iterations, the game implemented some really neat features, like support for up to 4 players and a level designer, allowing players to create their own dungeons. Eventually, a version of the game was published for Atari 8-bit home computers. John Palovich was working for Atari at the time, but by 1985, he was no longer with the company. According to a 2015 interview with Palovich, he didn't find out about Gauntlet until after the game hit arcades. Initially, he sought legal counsel, but the matter was settled out of court. Palovich wanted to retain the right to continue to develop Dandy outside of what Atari was doing with Gauntlet, which Atari was happy to grant him. Atari also gave him a Gauntlet cabinet, which he claimed to have gotten plenty of use out of over the years. John acknowledged that he could have possibly been more aggressive with Atari and gained some sort of royalties for Gauntlet, but he chose not to go that route. There was also some question as to whether or not MIT would have any stake in the Dandy property, as the game was initially created as his thesis for the university, but MIT opted to leave the whole thing alone. In that same 2015 interview, John also acknowledges that Gauntlet made many improvements to the design concepts found in Dandy, like the presence of a dungeon master and greater variety in enemy types. The 2 major complaints that John expressed about Gauntlet are directly tied to it being an arcade game. In Gauntlet, putting in a quarter gives the player a certain amount of health, which steadily decreases as the game runs.
The health, that's part of D&D for one.
Right.
Number two, your health decreases as you go through the game. It's just, you need energy. So it's basically losing energy. And that's the way to get them to put more quarters in so you can continue to play. And so it's something you need to get. You want to get power-ups. Energy is a good power-up. It lets you play longer. But it also is a competitive factor in the sense that I want it. I don't want you to get it unless I really need you, and let's say, okay, I'll let you have it this time, kind of thing. And that's the impetus for the dungeon master coming out and saying, ooh, the elf has eaten all the food lately.
In Dandy, players can gain or lose health points throughout the game, and if a player dies, they can be revived by other players. Dandy has a clear end goal and final level, but Gauntlet has no end, and through certain exploits, it could technically be played forever. Although Dandy has been cited as a direct inspiration for Gauntlet, I think it's worth noting that similar gameplay concepts were explored earlier in other titles, like 1983's Time Bandit or 1982's Tutankhamun. These games all have players moving around a maze with a top-down perspective while they fire at enemies and collect keys to advance. Even Ed Logg himself created a game that contained some concepts that are similar to what we'd eventually see in Dandy, with 1981's Maze Invaders. This game was never fully released into arcades, but it was included in the Atari Flashback Classics collection. In the game, players navigate a series of interconnected mazes, traveling by way of warp points, which is similar to the navigation between levels in Dandy. Gauntlet was a hugely successful game that spawned 8 other main entries in the Gauntlet series, and dozens of ports and adaptations.
Again, Gauntlet was awesome because, again, it was this big, imposing thing that was just new, and it was 4 players.
For me, it's all about Gauntlet. Grew up in England, still live here, obviously, and I just remember seeing that arcade machine back in the old days, in those famous arcades in the 80s. I was very young at the time, and I just remember seeing this game. I think it's the first 4-person cabinet I saw, and I've got 2 brothers, so I was like, well, my mum was like, let's play a game together. She would chuck us on this game. Now, we didn't know what we were doing really, but I loved it, and it's one of those games where, you know, I'm the middle brother. We like to sort of fight and so forth and muck about. But we had to work as a team, and I loved it. It's one of those very earliest games for me when we had to sort of have strategy in place, work together. It wasn't like a fighting game, wasn't a Street Fighter game. We had to sort of, you know, collaborate and work together, and we could almost use one brother as a decoy, move the characters off the screen, and we had to sort of move in and grab the keys and whatnot. So many great memories of the first game. We'd move all the enemies to one area of the screen. My brother, for example, might be the wizard, and I might, as 4, he was my favorite character, the kind of barbarian guy. I'd go and try and find the keys and the secrets. So I just really respect those sort of top-down sort of games, and who doesn't like the fantasy setting? So big fan of the Gauntlet games. The early games in the series, obviously 1 and 2 for me particularly.
Yeah, just look at the amount of indie games that are developed nowadays, the amount of tower defense games, the amount of titles where you feel overwhelmed. You're going through stuff with that kind of above view. Yeah, absolutely fantastic.
My favorite Ed Logg game is probably Gauntlet. And Gauntlet is interesting because when you think about it at the time, the way screens worked was designers could only put so many sprites on the screen at once. But Ed could have dozens of characters on the screen, dozens of characters, objects, items on the screen in Gauntlet. And he did that because he created this algorithm that let him manipulate over 1,000 objects in Gauntlet without burdening the processor or slowing down the frame rate. That's because, in part, he asked Pat McCarthy, one of the engineers, if he could extend the existing hardware, and Pat found a way to do that, which allowed Ed to display all the objects on the screen that he wanted. So Gauntlet was not only a blast to play, but it was a technological breakthrough at the time. A lot of arcade goers hadn't really seen something like that before.
It was like a massively frantic shooter, which you didn't expect. It was not a relaxing stroll. It was like you put your money in and it's go time. And you've got to like communicate with your friends because you've already got so much like screen collateral. And if you start going different places, it's almost like a predecessor to like WarioWare or something like that, where it's just like, go, panic, and you go, I don't know what I'm doing.
I've put so much money into Gauntlet. Like, they got their money back just probably from how many quarters I've dropped into that with my friends. That game, to me, being a young kid playing like Dungeons and Dragons and everything, getting to get in there and fight over who was going to be what class and all of that, and then jumping in and learning how to work as a team in Gauntlet, and just, I know they're ridiculously punishingly difficult game, but it's made up by the fact that you get to play it with three of your friends, which means you get to add in the yelling at them and them yelling at you. Friendships ending over them not protecting you. And then the other game, of course, that I was playing a lot, like at home, I was obsessed with, and kind of still am, is Zork. So a lot of the Infocom stuff, but specifically Zork. And then having this sort of Gauntlet, where like Gauntlet being this next jump in games where it wasn't just immediate action, you know what I mean? Where it's just button pressing and like action stuff, but there almost seems to be this light sense of a plot that isn't just what's painted on the side of the machine. There's more that's just in there. But then also this feeling of progression that was closer to playing something like Zork or playing something like Dungeons and Dragons, where it really feels you could get lost in that game in a really big way. And it really showed what a game could be. We just played ludicrous amounts of it. We're asked to get dropped off at the movie theater a solid hour before a movie started, just so we could buy tickets and then go hang out in the arcade and scrounge for quarters in all of the machines so we could play as much Gauntlet for the most part as we could get in there.
I think one thing about Gauntlet was the amount of stuff that was happening on screen all at the same time, which was really impressive. You'd seen stuff in Robotron, but the level of graphics that this had was really, really impressive. And I think that led on to other titles as well, stuff later on like Smash TV, Total Carnage as well. That really reminds me of Gauntlet, and that kind of overwhelming waves and waves of people coming, and that also leads to tower defense games as well, stuff where you're being overwhelmed. Survival games at the moment with waves of zombies, having to fight hordes off and stuff. And that's a theme that's, stuck in video game lineage for a long, long time.
And the game was the first time that is basically $1 per play. And that never, people were getting very reluctant to play 50 cents per play, and now here's a game that you only put a quarter in, but as far as the operator is concerned, it's $1 a play. It's $1 at a time. And they saw huge, earnings from the game.
In 1986, Atari released Gauntlet II. Under Ed's direction, Paperboy programmer Bob Flanagan worked on both Gauntlet and Gauntlet II. The sequel doesn't shake things up too much and feels like an expanded version of the first game. Still, it's a great entry into the series. When it was released, Atari held a contest where players could find a code in a secret room in the game. The game provided players some hints as to how to find the room. The first 500 players to find the secret room and mail the code to Atari would win a Gauntlet II t-shirt and be entered into a drawing for a $5,000 savings bond. Gauntlet wouldn't return to arcades until 1998's Gauntlet Legends. That game is notable for including a password system that allows players to save their character progression. If you were to reach a maximum level of 99 with a character and reach the end of the game, you would become a member of the 99er Club. In a move similar to the Gauntlet II promotion, a limited number of players who achieved this could mail their information to Atari for a free t-shirt. There was also a different shirt available for players who could beat the game at lower levels. After Gauntlet II, Ed Logg didn't work on any of the later Gauntlet games, but his next game at Atari was originally intended to be released as Gauntlet III. Working again with programmer Bob Flanagan, 1987's Xybots began as Ed's attempt to create a multiplayer game in the style of the original Castle Wolfenstein. The result is a third-person shooter that has players exploring 3D mazes that might call to mind the 3D stages in Contra, which was also released in 1987. However, the major difference here is that while Contra has players moving forward while taking left or right turns, Xybots allows players to fully rotate their characters using a rotating joystick. 2 players can play at once, with gameplay on the bottom half of the screen and the top half containing player stats and a map. In an interview from issue 39 of Games TM magazine, Ed shared that a majority of players struggled to adjust to the 3D controls, and didn't quite understand that the character's perspective would shift as the joystick was rotated. The game was ahead of its time, and players weren't quite ready for this sort of 3D navigation. Reading that interview reminded me of 2000's Alien Resurrection for the PlayStation 1. This game is cited as being the first FPS to use a dual analog control scheme. That control scheme would eventually become standard for FPS games on home consoles, but many reviewers at the time cited the controls as being hard to adjust to and one of the worst aspects of the game.
Yeah, even though there had been like your Battle Zones and your Star Wars, arcade games that pulled it off with that vector look, that was cool. Though I always felt like, Star Wars was great because it was a thing you already knew from the movie, but then a simplified version of it. So then you projected all these fantasies onto this very simply rendered world. Whereas Battlezone to me was like very neat, but maybe not a great game. It's like, wow, this is a tank thing in 3D. Oh, that's what we got here. It was like, and it was revolutionary at that, and that was enough, right? Obviously, become a hit, and people remember it. Made new versions of that, but it didn't have an identity to me in the way that like an Asteroids or Centipede or Gauntlet did. So that's kind of interesting. Some of the pushing the technology too soon leads to something interesting, but not perfect necessarily.
Xybots was originally conceived as Gauntlet 3 Catacombs, but higher-ups at Atari didn't want to do another Gauntlet game. Ed reluctantly complied.
That's right, it was called Catacombs with Gauntlet characters. And marketing came in and said, no Gauntlet, no Gauntlet, no more Gauntlet, we don't want to see any more Gauntlet. And I actually caved to him. I did a Major Havoc style. I took a Major Havoc style 2 characters. And I wish I'd have stuck with Gauntlet, quite honestly. That was the one time I acquiesced to marketing.
Instead, Ed and his team went with a theme inspired by Major Havoc, a 1983 game that we covered in the deep dive into the roots of the microgame genre, which you can check out right here. After you finish watching this, of course. Players would take on the role of either Major Rock Hardy or Captain Ace Gunn as they took out hordes of enemy robots. Players could also purchase various upgrades and items in a shop in between levels. Players would also occasionally face a large talking robot boss character, dubbed the Master Xybot. Despite his best efforts to fit 4 players into the game, like he did in Gauntlet, Ed couldn't make it work in Xybots due to the game's perspective. Still, from what I've read in various online forums and comment sections, players have expressed their appreciation for the cooperative gameplay. Xybots allowed players to strategize on how to clear out enemies, and they could trade currency with one another at the in-game shops.
When Xybots would have come out, I would have been around 10 years old. And we didn't have arcades like you see on Stranger Things, and the only arcades would be in chip shops, like fish and chip shops, taxi ranks, and real sketchy kind of like pool halls and things like that. So, me and my friends, we'd go down into town because we could walk it there, and it's completely unsafe. Some of these places I would not go to now. Like, there's no, as a grown man, there's no way. If my kids, were going in, you're like, woo, very sketchy, real sketchy. But it was like the thrill of the hunt because you'd have all these different arcade games and they would change quite regularly. There was a chip shop and we're walking past and there was this big arcade cabinet and it was like a really like weird shape. and you're like, what is this? So we kind of, me and my mate, I can't remember who I was with, but there's a couple of mates that don't knock about and do the same kind of thing on a Saturday, go out and with all your kind of 10p's in credits and everything, and there's this game called Xybots. And you're like, what is this? And it looked cool, and I think one of the things that's kind of unsung about it is the layout, because you had these kind of two screens, so it was like 2-player, it was split screen. But then you had another screen that you've never seen until like the DS comes out, and you've got the whole kind of flip screen thing. So you've got like your data and all your information at the top and the action at the bottom. But back in those days, like now you get fancy HUDs, you get all these kind of AAA games with these cool HUDs that kind of pop up and project, like holograms like into your space helmet directly and things like that. So it felt like that. It felt like I'm playing this game, I've got this map, and I've got this readout, and there was like words and things to read, and you're like, oh, wow, like, it's deep, because it had like a slight RPG element, because you could buy things and collect things and spend money and things like that. So when you saw it, it was like awe-inspiring. It was a big machine. It was a real weird shape, and it looked like the future. And then you go, all right, what's this game? I'm shooting these things, and then there's all these instructions like you can twist the joystick. And you're like, oh. It was third person before third person was a thing. It was way ahead of its time, and I don't think there was anything like that for years until like Midnight Resistance came along, which had you could spin your arm around, and then obviously when the time that Doom was out, you got a lot of games that were mouse and keyboard, but this was like way ahead of its time, so it was awesome.
Xybots was one I had heard of and had never really played it in the arcade back in the day. And it had a very unique perspective, kind of behind the character. And it really wasn't until like I saw how the joystick worked on it, where it was turning left and right. You can tell games that they really have a lot of faith in when they let a programmer or designer do something so out there. And this was kind of like 3D perspective going on, and to have a custom like the joystick where you're turning left and right, it's a pretty big commitment to put a stick like that out there for R&D, and it was way ahead of its time. Playing it that first time, I loved that game. It was so good. And it really wasn't until recently we put into a tournament. We put in some games in tournaments that we think have been overlooked. And it was spot on. So many of the players, even after the tournament, they're like, I got to go play more of that. And it really was, there were so many games coming out then. And I think it was just, it didn't get the recognition just because I think it was too ahead of its time. And it's great to see people play it now and really kind of get into it.
I always had a hard time with the controls, which... yeah, I mean, it's a very confusing thing because you're using tank controls basically on a human being. But the concept of it and look of it, I don't think it gets enough respect for what would come so short after it. And I refuse to believe that like Wolfenstein, Doom, Quake, like the 90s style first-person shooters don't owe so much to Xybots. Look alone. Was it Berserk too? I think there was that Berserk had a little bit of that. Or okay, was it Berserk? I can't remember. There was another game that kind of came a little bit after it that had a little bit of the same look. And yeah, it's mind-blowing because it's, even though the controls are really difficult to understand, I think especially when you've just popped in a quarter and you just immediately have to jump into doing this thing that there's, especially at the time, no corollary for. It's fascinating to look at.
Xybots was actually, they wanted to create their Castle Wolfenstein, not Wolfenstein 3D that id Software made, but the Apple II game Castle Wolfenstein, where you'd sneak around and kill Nazis. But that was done from an overhead view. Xybots was actually one of the first third-person shooters, which is a pretty cool little bit of trivia, I think. But they wanted to do multiplayer, in that. And so that's how Xybots was kind of created.
But interesting that, they would take Castle Wolfenstein later and make it 3D, but just nothing like Castle Wolfenstein, other than it's a, German castle and there's Nazis. And so it's interesting that he too took Castle Wolfenstein as an inspiration. I remember he mentioned that in the interview. It was like, oh, could we take that and move it here and turn it into a 3D thing? But just in a way that, some years later would be done in 3D in a totally different way. That was obviously a much bigger success, for market reasons and what platform it was on and all of that stuff.
If you look at it now, it's cool. It's very, very cool. But the impact back then, where you had this, again, like an extra dimension on top of your games, it was really, really good.
Ed's next game at Atari is one that we discussed at the top of this video. Tetris for the NES has a story rich enough to deserve its own video, and there are many videos out there on the topic if you want to dive deeper.
As a kid, I had a Dandy console, a clone of 8-bit Nintendo, and I had no reason to complain. I got to play 100 games. We used to have multi-game cartridges from 2 to 6 in 1. Of course, there were also the famous 9.99 in 1 cartridges, and those had the arcade classics mostly. But those games were usually played by the adults. Kids like me loved something brighter and more fun. I remember I had a neighbor and we'd often to get together to play video games. His mom was a huge video game fan, by the way. She was literally a local Bomberman champion. One day I come out to his place, we were probably 6 or 7. He told me, my mom is playing right now, let's wait a bit and then it's our turn. Of course, I was going to play something cool like Darkwing Duck, Contra, DuckTales, whatever. We walk into his room and I see his mom stuck in the falling blocks. I already know about Tetris. I had seen the handheld electronic game called Brick Games, but this time I was impressed by how masterfully she was playing. My friends told me they had several Tetris cartridges before, but this one was absolutely the best. It had the multiple modes, so you could play with 2 players. Sounds cool, doesn't it? Speaking of the Tetris, I remember the title screen with the cheerful music and the image of St. Basil Cathedral. It really stood out from all other games I was used to. Later I got to play both versions of the game, 10-gen in Nintendo's, and I have to say with confidence, Ed Logg did a really great job. He polished the gameplay until it was incredibly smooth, following the principle that a game should hook you from the first minute. On top of that, he managed to add numerous game modes including co-op. Tetris by 10-gen was the only version with this feature. This was incredible for its time. So, that was a day I realized there were a version of Tetris that was way better than the simple electronic game, and even better than the other Tetris game on the system.
Well, like going to the NES, for example, from Coin Op proper, it was pretty much, stamp and a few motion object. It was same stuff. It was just on a fixed hardware instead of something that I could modify for have different control or something. So it was fixed controls, but the hardware is pretty much similar. So it was not a problem for that. The interesting thing about it, and it's, as I said with earlier hardwares, is that you had to be really innovative on how to implement them. And that's still the case. For example, I did Tetris. Well, I did Asteroids and Centipede until Atari Games sued Atari and found out that the judge said everything prior to this date Atari owns, everything after this date Atari Games owns, so I couldn't do Asteroids and Centipede on the NES. But I could do Tetris, so I did Tetris for the NES. And there's a long story behind that as well.
To put things very simply, Ed programmed Tetris for the NES totally from scratch. It was released in 1989 under the Tengen label, which was a subsidiary of Atari.
Ed had, at the time, fortuitously been reverse engineering the Nintendo family computer, the Famicom, which soon became, of course, the NES in the US. And he was able to create Tetris for the Famicom and the NES based on his ability to reverse engineer the console, which is something a lot of programmers had to be able to do back then. Nintendo they kind of ruled with an iron fist, right? They would only allow developers and publishers to publish, I think, 5 games a year unless you created other labels. That's how Konami was able to publish so many games a year. Because of that, they viewed other companies as competition, even though they're also making money from their games on their own platform. So because of that, Nintendo often wouldn't supply development kits to publishers. Publishers had to have someone like Ed Logg who knew how to reverse engineer systems and figure out how to develop games that way.
I guess you'd say, I wanted to make it simultaneous play. And so, that is something, that I added to the console game that I couldn't do necessarily on a coin-op game. But somebody took my code over and I thought it was Greg Rivera, but I don't think so. I think Norm Avalar and took it over and did the arcade version on that. But for me, I just wanted to do something not the same as a PC game, and simultaneous play is something you could do on a console very easily because they always have two controllers. And so, yeah, that was my addition to that game.
Soon after launch, the game was recalled due to a legal dispute between Atari and Nintendo, leading to around 200,000 copies of the Tengen version of Tetris being destroyed. In a 1999 interview, Ed estimated that around 50,000 copies made their way out into the world, and that he saw some of these copies going for up to $250 at the time. As recently as 2025, loose copies of the game have fetched $80 to $100, while boxed copies are still going for $250 to $300. There's a lot more to the story of Tetris for the NES. Atari and Nintendo were in a heated legal battle over the rights to the game, and over Nintendo's claim that Atari violated a patent in order to produce their own cartridges for the NES, and Atari claiming that Nintendo had a monopoly on the games industry. There are a lot of different accounts of how this all went down, but if you'd like to hear more of Ed's perspective on the matter, I recommend this interview that he did with Atari HQ back in 1999. Everyone who has played the game is likely to have their own favorite version of Tetris, and the one that Ed programmed for the NES has long been a contender for the top spot. In 1991, Atari launched Steel Talons. This is a combat-focused flight simulator where players take on the role of a pilot training to join the ranks of the Steel Talons, which are a helicopter pilot equivalent of the Green Berets or Navy SEALs.
Steel Talons came about because I wanted to do a game based on, biplanes, which if you do jets, that's what marketing came back. No, come on, we want to do jets, big, powerful jets. I said, no, you're going to see a dot and it's going to go fly by you. That's no fun. You want something slow enough that you can see what's coming and react to it and so on. And so I went from biplanes. I said, okay, I can do a helicopter. So I did a helicopter simulation. And then, the hardware was hard driving hardware, but I wanted to do fogging because things were, distant. Yeah. I needed to bring them in. So I went to the hardware engineer and I asked him, if you change the microcoding on your computers, I can do fogging. No, I can't do it. You can't do that. So I created a method for doing it with color palettes because there were a lot of color palettes, and they didn't think it was possible, but they're kind of amazed. So I caught Jed Marglin in one day with a woman showing off his driveway with the fogging effect. So he must have been impressed too. He was the engineer on hard driving.
I played a console port of it originally, which I really liked it, and it made me want to see the arcade version. And I finally picked up the arcade version. We don't have it on the arcade floor, but it is hidden away in the vaults, and I've got it up and running. And we picked that one up out in Mississippi, and was so happy when I saw it sitting there, because it is a large 2-player side-by-side sit-down cabinet, and just a beautiful, beautiful game.
Yes, we did actually have that at Joe's Playland, I believe was the arcade that we had on Salisbury Beach. And again, that was one I don't have a huge recollection of it outside of I know I played it, and that was another one that was so cool to just like get inside of. I'm a sucker for the get inside the arcade machines where you can just shut out the whole, like that you no longer, the fourth wall disappears. You're just like in it at that point. You don't have to suspend your disbelief. You're just there. And I love those styles of games. I mean, to an extent, like also like, was it the San Francisco Rush as well? Just being able to sit in those machines, like it so encompasses your vision. They're so big in that way that it, yeah, you could just lose yourself, which was pretty awesome.
The game presents itself as a simulator that is used to test the skills of potential Steel Talons pilots. The game can be played solo, cooperatively, or in a head-to-head battle mode. In the main campaign, players go through 12 levels that see them navigating a variety of maps and taking out different targets. Upon release, the game was widely applauded for realistic controls and engaging gameplay. I could find disappointingly little modern coverage of the game online, but I did find a video on YouTube uploaded back in 2012, recorded by an actual helicopter pilot. He restored his own Steel Talons machine, and commented that he found the game to be very realistic, even over 20 years after its release. The game is housed in a 6-foot-tall, 900-pound unit that includes 2 monitors, 2 sets of controls, and 2 seats. Each seat is equipped with a rump-thump solenoid, which is basically a larger version of the same sort of mechanism that powers most pinball machines. When your helicopter takes a hit, the seat sends up a loud jolt. A review for the game over on Giant Bomb describes the sensation as both feeling and sounding violent, as if a hammer were being banged against the seat. This same feature was also included in Road Riot 4-Wheel Drive, which also came out in 1991. While the default controls for the game were intentionally made to be accessible as possible for new players, the control panel has a button that activates a mode called Real Heli Flight, which according to the manual for the game, swaps the player's helicopter for a realistic computer model of a modified Black Hawk Model S-67. This mode is intended for highly skilled players and actual helicopter pilots. The game also features both third and first-person perspectives. Trade magazines from the time of its release note that Steel Talons was a popular cabinet, but I haven't yet found any modern arcades that have one. I did find some online sales listings for a few, including a $250 listing from 2020 and a $75 listing from 2016. Due to its massive size and weight, I imagine it's not the easiest game for someone to add to their collection, but if you see one out in the wild, you should definitely give it a spin. Following the release of Steel Talons, Ed Logg and Bob Flanagan joined forces once again, this time to bring us Space Lords. This is a space combat game that includes 2 screens and can support 2 players per screen. Each screen is dedicated to a pilot, who can also have a co-pilot. A link cable could connect 2 units together, allowing for 4 screens and up to 8 simultaneous players. There are various game modes allowing for cooperative or head-to-head gameplay against human or computer-controlled ships. The mission mode has players take on a series of aliens, with each one represented by these really cool portraits. Each alien has its own ship and behaviors, pushing players to switch up their strategies between missions.
Space Lords was one that I had heard of but never saw in the arcade back in the day. I didn't really know much about it aside just from hearing the name. And my first time ever seeing it was in a warehouse in Mississippi. And it was our first trip out there, and the cabinet was huge. It was 4-player, similar to like a run and gun or a cyberball cabinet. Marquee was this big angled piece of artwork and so cool. And I asked about it, and they're like, the operators were like, that's our least favorite game. It's huge. They had never played it, it just took up such a huge amount of space. And they were like, it didn't earn back in the day. So we're literally going to burn this cabinet. Like, and they let us, they're like, you can take it for $100 or we're burning it. And I was like, okay, it's Atari. I have no idea what this game is. It took a little bit to get it up and running, but what an amazing game. Reminded me a little bit of a game called Star Control, which had a lot of different aliens that you played against, and you had to blow up their fleet of ships. And this had more depth to it from the control standpoint, because you could play it single player, you could have 2 players on a team, you could just play 2 players against each other, or you could do the full 2-on-2. And one was a pilot, one was a gunner, and you had to look behind you and you could collect all these missiles. And it was, the enemies all had different tech strategies and formations, and just the artwork was so good and very fast paced, and it just, what a great game. And it was such a true shame that like people weren't aware of it back in the day. But again, you can see they were given such a broad path to design something, because here you've got 2 monitors, 2 throttle controls, and 4 sticks, and a lot of expense went into this. And when you see a game that has that, you can tell that the company has a lot of faith in the designers and the programmers. And it was just one of those, again, I think it was way ahead of its time. It's just an incredible game that I don't think even now people don't know about it. We tell people about it, and the depth that you have to spend a little time to get the nuances of it and understand that it's kind of like a cross between like a Star Trek and just like this mad air battle going on. And it's like, it's so good. It's so good.
Well, for me, it was can I do a 3D game in 2D? And the answer was, yeah, you do, but you have to have a radar, which is not very good, but at least, it gives you some idea what's going on. So you can map a 3D world into 2D and actually make it work. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was just isn't this even possible? And the answer is yes, it's possible. It's kind of funky, but.
Space Lords was inconsistent when it came to earnings. It did better at locations that could accommodate double cabinets, but single cabinet locations underperformed. It was also a time where arcades were being dominated by games like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. These fighting games were often sold as kits that could be modified and converted at a cost lower than that of buying an entirely new cabinet, making them especially appealing to arcade owners. It was around this time that Ed Logg began eyeing a transition out of the coin-op market and into consumer games, meaning games made for home consoles.
I mean, I started in coin-op because there was no really home games that I could do that were, reasonable. The VCS was really underpowered graphically. And so the coin-op game was fine. Now, you'll have to realize that I started in an industry where there was no precedence. If I were to do a game now, everybody said, well, that's a little part of this game, a little part of that game, and some of this. So I don't think it's really hard to create a really unique game these days. Whereas back in those days, anything you did was probably unique. And so I was benefited from that. As far as your question of console versus coin-op, some of it is marketing, because once the home consoles took off and the arcade started to die, economics said, I really need to be on the home consoles. And for me, as I said, the early home consoles looked just like our early coin-operated hardware, so it was not a big jump.
His final arcade game to see release was Space Lords, but he worked on a few others before moving to focus on developing for the Nintendo 64. In an interview, Ed mentioned briefly working with some former Atari colleagues at EA. There, he worked on 2 arcade games, a puzzle game and a shooting game, but both were cancelled and EA wound up dropping out of the coin-op market soon after. He also worked on another scrapped shooting game at Atari, but the gun from this scrapped game was later repurposed for 1995's Area 51. Between 1996 and the year 2000, Ed Logg worked on 4 different games for the Nintendo 64, as well as one title for the Dreamcast. These were all developed under Atari Games, published by Midway Games, and included Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey, as well as 3 different entries in the Rush series of racing games.
Ed had been there. He told us a little bit about being in the trenches and about his history working on console adaptations and working on the arcade experience. And I really got the sense of the freedom that the Atari creators back in the day for the arcade division had. You know, it wasn't a constraint on budget. It was a constraint on imagination. And they would spend technologically, add the hardware pieces to implement that vision as best they could. And I heard this from him, and I heard this also from Eugene Jarvis, where there is this real appreciation for the limitless kind of quality of video game experience as told through arcade machinery. You know, there's a real nuts and bolts like derivation that has, like, you have to strip things out to fit them onto the console. We saw that big time on the 2600, and Ed lived through that and worked through that. And then we saw it again big time when 3D games started to happen in the arcades, and they were ported to, because there was that time right around when we were getting going where there were 2D arcade games that were replicated 1-to-1 at home for the first time. You know, it's kind of started at the tail end of the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo a little bit. And it was incredible. And then we went to 3D, and then 3D arcade games were, for a little while, like San Francisco Rush, much more advanced than what we could have at home. And then, of course, that became 1-to-1 again. But Ed had this distinct kind of observation of, and unique life experience of kind of living through that twice, you know, back in the first console boom and then again in the 3D console boom. It was just really a dream realized to speak with him and other people like him, you know, to have been around to see their work and to wonder how these things got made. And there's still so much of a mystery around how video games get done. There's so much magic that happens in that last 3 frickin' months of a game coming together. And there's so much of like, this ain't working, this ain't working, this sucks, this is not going to work, this sucks, this sucks, this sucks. And then, okay, it's going to work. It's working, you know? And for a person like Ed Logg, who, I mean, he saw so much of that, you know? And it's so hard to freaking fathom how these guys just looked at a blank black screen or whatever and just programmed their way into our lives. You know, they made things that people were moved by. And I was one of them. I was one of those kids. I was at the arcade going, holy crap, this is incredible. You can't do this anywhere else, you know? And I was one of those kids that bought a 2600 and then a ColecoVision and a Vectrex and all of these different machines, just blown away by the work. And then to my great joy, I was able to meet these people, you know, and communicate with them and express my gratitude.
When Ed was first tasked with making a console version of Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey, Atari just wanted a straight, no-frills conversion. This had worked for the company in the past, but over time, arcades and home consoles came to offer very different experiences for players.
Some of it you have to realize the mentality of the market. For coin-op, you want them to put a quarter in every 90 seconds or so. And that was Nolan Bushnell's idea. I didn't agree with it. I agreed that, you know, I can have a shorter game if they're basically play like idiots and have a longer game if they're really, really good. And I went with that philosophy because that's what the players want to see. They get rewarded when they can play for a long time. They feel they're really good. And that's, you see that in Asteroids, you see that in Centipede, and a lot of the other my better games where you can play for a long time. Whereas the home console, you don't have that limitation. You don't have to get their quarter. They already spent their $20 or $40 to buy the console. What you want to provide them with is depth. So you want to add wave after wave or different enemies or different situations. So the design process is totally different.
Ed has been quoted as saying, "Arcade pieces must be easy to learn with rules that are obvious, and provide entertainment that lasts 90 seconds. The home market is not bound by these rules. Instead, you must provide more life for your product. Often, this means it takes the player longer to finish the game. Even when the player has finished it, there must be reasons why he will want to go back to do it all over again."
I can't speak for other people, but I've seen games too that I don't think fit that criteria either. They were one trick, and it's kind of repeating it over and over, or something to that effect. And it's like, no, guys, you don't get it. This is a home console. They've already bought your product. Do something, show them something new.
Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey was the first 4-player game on the N64, beating the Japanese release of Mario Kart 64 by 1 month. While 3D Hockey did include many additions not found in the arcade version, one in particular appears to have been removed before the game was released. A 1996 issue of GamePro features a preview of the title, which mentions Mortal Kombat-style finishing moves. A year later, GamePro would respond to reader mail about these finishing moves, stating that Midway had decided to remove them. Many years later, fans discovered a ROM of a particular build of the arcade version of the game that still had some of these finishing moves intact. They aren't nearly as violent as the fatalities in Mortal Kombat, but from what I've read, the NHL still didn't like the idea, and it never saw a public release. When it came out, Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey for the N64 received many positive reviews, with the most contentious part of the game being that it wasn't very realistic. If you were looking for hardcore hockey simulation, this game wasn't going to scratch that itch. But if you wanted a more accessible pick-up-and-play style sports game similar to NBA Jam or NFL Blitz, 3D Hockey was a great choice, especially when it came to multiplayer. Aside from attending a few Syracuse Crunch games back in the 90s, I know almost nothing about hockey, and I was able to pick up the basics of the game almost immediately. In my opinion, it still holds up today and is a great addition to any Nintendo 64 collection. Not long after completing work on 3D Hockey, Ed signed on to do a home version of San Francisco Rush Extreme Racing.
My first experience with San Francisco Rush came shortly after the release of the N64 game. That would have been in late 1997. I acquired it from a friend who had bought it, didn't like it, and I think I swapped something with him for that game. And my initial thoughts of the game were that I really enjoyed it. The chaotic nature of the races, the sort of the pseudo open world circuits, the crazy physics of all the cars kind of crashing all over the place and careening into each other was just a breath of fresh air on the N64. There was nothing really like it at the time that I played, certainly. I fell in love with it.
There was something really wonderful about San Francisco Rush and just how effortlessly gratifying it was. Maybe it was tied to how much time I was spending in San Francisco. I was down there all the time visiting game companies and talking with studios and then playing the N64 game like crazy. And I played it a lot in the arcade as well. And then to meet that team, and I was so early in my career, I think it was our first season that we were down there. It was the first time that I met Ed and visited Atari headquarters. And it was so profound. It was so cool to see how it came together. And Ed was that Gandalf in a way. Dan Van Elderen even more so, because Dan had been at Atari when you know, they would leave the programming pods and then they would go put the cartridges together and put them in the box that would go shipping to stores. And just to hear that kind of side of it. But Ed had been there for a long time too. He was a vet, you know, he'd seen some things. Yeah, it was really cool. And also to get, you know, that sense of the difference of making the N64 version of San Francisco Rush compared to the arcade game and the you know, limitless amounts of freedom they had that they had to build that game. So I think if I had to pick one Ed Logg game that I like the most, it's tough because they're all good. They're all great. But I don't know, San Francisco Rush holds a special place in my heart. I love that game.
At its core, San Francisco Rush is a classic arcade-style racer. You compete in single races or a series of races, with a clock that is steadily counting down. Every time you pass a checkpoint, you add some more time to your clock. In all of the home conversions that Ed worked on, he added new content and features that gave the games whole new layers of depth for players. Personally speaking, I remember being a huge fan of the Rush games on the Nintendo 64. I put countless hours into those games, especially the first one. When I finally got around to trying the arcade version of it, I was shocked to see that some of my favorite cars from the N64 version were missing, and that some of the shortcuts I had discovered on certain courses hadn't been included. The arcade versions of the Rush games are definitely a great experience for racing fans, with the steering wheel, pedals, and the overall immersion offered by the cabinets being almost impossible to duplicate at home. However, the additions offered in the home versions really speak to how in tune Ed was with the differences between the two markets. In addition to the new courses added to San Francisco Rush, each course could be experienced in 4 different ways. There was the standard initial version of each course, as well as mirrored, reversed, or reversed and mirrored versions. While it may sound simple, these variations add a lot of replay value to the game. The courses were designed in such a way that each variation feels distinct. San Francisco Rush Extreme Racing on the N64 was followed by 2 sequels, Rush 2 Extreme Racing USA, and San Francisco Rush 2049. While each entry shares many core similarities, I feel that the gameplay and overall experience is improved upon with each entry. I still really love that first one, but the controls can feel stiff, which is something that some reviewers mentioned back when it first came out.
Yes, when the reviews came out, they weren't very positive, shall we say, but I didn't care about that. I was having a great time with the N64 version of San Francisco Rush. And yeah, it was a game that stayed firmly inserted into the cartridge slot of my N64 for a long time.
The controls in Rush 2 are a huge improvement, and the game also included the ability to modify your vehicle, allowing you to fine-tune how the cars will feel and perform.
It was only when San Francisco Rush 2 or Rush 2 Extreme Racing USA came out that I found a worthy successor to San Francisco Rush. And again, another game that I absolutely loved. Obviously, it moves away from San Francisco Rush as the main world that you play your races in, taking in cities from across the United States. You know, you've got Las Vegas, Seattle, and of course, San Francisco.
Unlike the first entry in the series, Rush 2 is not a home conversion of an arcade game. Instead, it's a wholly original game exclusive to the Nintendo 64. The arcade version of San Francisco Rush did get a direct arcade sequel, titled San Francisco Rush The Rock Alcatraz Edition. This was offered as a standalone machine or as an upgrade kit for existing Rush cabinets, and it included all of the new tracks that Ed and his team had created for the home conversion of San Francisco Rush. In 1999, San Francisco Rush 2049 was released in arcades, and 1 year later, a home version was released for the N64 and Dreamcast. Once again, Ed and his team took the core gameplay of the arcade version and expanded on it. All 3 of Ed's Rush games included things like collectibles to hunt for, split-screen multiplayer, and stunt tracks, but Rush 2049 really took the stunts to the next level. The courses in the Rush series are full of all sorts of ramps and jumps that lend themselves to chaotic action, and the home versions really doubled down on that aspect of the games. The first Rush game on N64 features a secret area called Pappyland, modeled by Todd Pappy, who would later have important roles in the development of the God of War series and Star Citizen. This area contains a bunch of ramps for players to mess around with, but if you wipe out and crash, you get sent out of the arena and back onto the racetrack. However, if you wanted to spend more time in Pappyland, you could do so through the use of cheat codes. Rush 2 revisited this idea with a proper stunt mode, complete with a scoring system. This stunt mode would go on to appear in the home version of Rush 2049, which went even further by giving its vehicles retractable wings that were not present in the arcade version. Anytime you're in the air, you can hold down a button to bring your wings out, allowing you to do barrel rolls and to have more control of your trajectory. Split-screen racing also returned in Rush 2049, but the multiplayer offerings are further expanded by a battle mode.
Yeah, and that's something I added because I didn't want it to be just a straight home port because they've already got it in the arcade. Why would they play my game? And when I did Rush 2049, I added the battle mode and stunt mode, stuff like that. And I remember going to reviews and the president of Midway come in and said, "Are you sure this is going to work?" And I said, "Yes, it is. Trust me, this is going to work." And then, 6 months down the line, when I had the Midway San Diego group come up, they said, they played the battle mode every lunch hour. They go out and play it every lunch hour. And they thought they were hot stuff. And I said, Todd Pappy, come over here, grab somebody and play these two guys. And they just, beat them like 15-3, and just clocked their asses. And they did this game after game. And I said, okay, these guys are good.
In recognition of the 25th anniversary of San Francisco Rush 2049, Jordan Freeman wrote the following. San Francisco Rush 2049, the peak of arcade racing and pinnacle of the arcade port, has turned 25 years old today. One of the greatest and most addictive multiplayer experiences in the history of games, right up there with Burnout 3 Takedown, GoldenEye 007, Halo, and Call of Duty. Easy to pick up and play, damn near impossible to master. Exactly what a game should be, and no wonder, since legendary designer Ed Logg was at the helm. The Dreamcast version perfected the physics, neo-futuristic atmosphere, adrenaline-pumping soundtrack, thanks to Barry Leach, and secret passageways that enthralled arcade goers. Then, as if that wasn't enough, they threw in the kitchen sink too. The Dreamcast port took the game to unfathomable heights with its addition of wings, absolutely insane battle mode, and hypnotically mesmerizing stunt mode. Even when you're being blown to bits, it's a blast. In fact, that's half the fun. This isn't nostalgia talking either. The fun has never stopped. I have to echo Jordan's sentiments on the battle mode. It is so much fun, and playing it today on original hardware, I'm happy to report that it totally holds up.
Well, that's the whole idea, is to have different weapons, different funds, different power-ups, all the things that you want to have in a battle game, something that it's like rock, paper, scissors, you want to have some rock and somebody else to have a scissors and try and find out who's going to win that particular weapon and to use it right.
By the time Rush 2049 was released in September of 2000, the N64 was winding down to make way for the GameCube, which would be released 1 year later. Despite the console showing its age, Rush 2049 for the N64 reviewed very well, and I personally spent a lot of time with the game. However, for as good as it looks, it pales in comparison to the Dreamcast port.
It was a really nice port, and the stunt mode was fun to play.
Prior to working on this video, I had never even seen the Dreamcast version of this game. But now having played it, I consider it to be the best in the series. It has everything that made the previous entries special, but with the added boost in performance and fidelity offered by the Dreamcast. There is also a general improvement to the sound, and it features more songs than were in the arcade or N64 versions. Barry Leach, who we mentioned at the start of this video, worked on the music for Rush 2, and both home versions of Rush 2049.
I got hired on unexpectedly. I was looking for a job, and a headhunter. I called a headhunter. Basically, she laughed when I told her I was a composer. And then it was about 6 weeks later, she called me back. She's like, "You still looking for a job? Because Atari are looking for a composer." I'm like, "Atari are still going?" This was in 96, 97, I think. And so it was like, so I interviewed with them, and they hired me. I moved down, and I was audio manager for the consumer division. They had the arcade division and the consumer division, two separate entities. So I got roped into doing that, and for basically the first 6 weeks there, I was banging out Rush 2 music. And of course, Atari were too cheap to pay for my moving expenses, so I basically every night I had to go around looking for a new hotel to stay at. At the time, it was basically MIDI and samples, just wavetable instruments. So I wrote all the music in a tracker format and then converted it to MIDI. Well, for the Dreamcast ones, we got to use CD tracks. So we were able to use some of the stuff from the arcade guys rather than have me reprogram everything, resequence everything I'd done for the Nintendo version. But we did do several tracks, if I remember right. I know the stunt track, I remember converting that, doing more of a CD version of it. Had some reverb on and stuff. Things you couldn't do in the N64. Doing the engine sounds was very troublesome. Didn't really involve Ed much. It was basically I went through everybody in the office to see what kind of cars they had, and we tried to record their engines. Some guy knew someone that had an AC Cobra, so we were out tearing up and down the road outside Atari with me dangling the microphone down by the exhaust. Did 60, 70 miles an hour. That was fun. But the best engine sound we got was actually from the secretary's. She had a piece of shit pickup truck. It was all rusted. It was like from the early 70s or something. Rust holding it together. And we recorded that at idle just to see, let's see how that does. Sounded fantastic once we pitched it up a few octaves. Sounded like a race car revving.
3, 2, 1, rush!
In 2005, Midway Arcade Treasures 3 was released for the Xbox, PlayStation 2, and GameCube. This is a collection of classic Midway arcade games, but interestingly, it features the Dreamcast version of Rush 2049 rather than a direct port of the arcade version. Ed has said in interviews that he generally didn't do many sequels, but that Rush 2049 was one that he was happy with. I also said earlier that all of these home console games were developed under the Atari Games label, but before the release of Rush 2049, that operation was renamed to Midway Games West. There is a long story there that I'll get to a little bit later in this video. While discussing Rush 2049 with Jordan Freeman, he let me know that it was one of his favorite games as well, and that he grew up playing it with his father and brother. Later in life, when Jordan met former Sega of America president Bernie Stolar, he told him that Rush 2049 was his favorite arcade-style racer, to which Bernie replied that it was his favorite too. While working on this video, I began to learn just how big of an impact Rush 2049 had on so many gamers. Many of my interview subjects for this project had a lot to say about this game.
The next game I'm going to ask you about, I'm pretty sure, is Jordan Freeman of Zoom Platform's favorite arcade racing game of all time. I'm pretty sure. The console port, at least, is. San Francisco Rush 2049.
I knew you were going to say that. I think it's a lot of people's favorite. 2049 was just kind of that step beyond, and it's one of those where there's so many driving games out there. And every mechanic of driving games has always kind of the bar keeps going up and up and up. 2049, definitely the fans of it just absolutely love it. And it's one of those that it competes with everything out there. It's just such a great game.
It still plays smooth. And what makes it special is like, there are games like F-Zero and stuff on Nintendo systems, but those cars, because it was also in the future, so SF 2049 obviously is in the future that we're fast approaching. And you drive these kind of cool, slick-looking cars, and it's a futuristic San Francisco. But something like F-Zero would essentially make the cars feel like they had no weight. I mean, even pole position, like these old arcade games, the cars didn't feel like that anything to them. Like, this is the first game I can remember where it was incredibly fast. It felt very fast. There were a lot of fun shortcuts and stuff, but the cars had some weight to them, so it actually felt a little bit like you were actually driving something of meaning, which isn't always common in futuristic kind of racing games, especially back in the day. But there was just something about that game that it was just so hard to put down and just so satisfying. Probably because it was on like the greatest system ever made in the Dreamcast.
I love San Francisco Rush 2049. That's probably my second favorite Ed Logg joint. It had a really cool environment with the arcade cabinets, but they were able to also do things in the home version that they couldn't do in the arcade. And this was around the time when arcades were kind of flagging. I never played 2049 in the arcade. I only played it on my Sega Dreamcast. And that actually might be the optimal way to play, because as Ed said, and I covered this in my book, Arcade Perfect, they were able to add a lot more options, more vehicles, more tracks, that sort of thing. So it was a more robust experience maybe than playing at the arcade.
I mean, I'll maintain that the Dreamcast had one of the greatest lineups in history. For a console that had a 2-year run, it had some real bangers. And, SF Rush, right, was a really fun arcade game. A lot of the arcade games, especially in this era that were getting ported, they didn't have much different to them, or it wasn't quite as special, because arcade games are meant to eat quarters. There's something about Rush actually at home, especially with your friends, because it had so many shortcuts and things to discover, and it moves so fast. Like, there was something actually beneficial about not having to worry about the quarters and the value of the replay. I don't know that there was an inspiration or there were fans from like the Super Mario World development team, but when I play that game, which is filled with like shortcuts, like it actually makes me think a little bit about SF Rush, where it's just like the whole point of the game is like the discovery of like, how do I cut through here? How do I find some way faster? It totally reminds me of the thrill of like, well, one, knowing how to get somewhere, like figuring that out, but then also like pulling it off, because some of those shortcuts are really tough to get through. And it was just a fun, fast, beautiful racer.
Another thing I love about Ed is his ability to bridge the gap between programmer and businessman. He can handle it all, and even serve as a mediator/translator between those two groups. Like my other hero and mentor, Bernie Stolar, Ed's able to see at least a decade ahead of everyone else. For both men, no matter what obstacles the powers that be would throw at them, they would always find a way to deliver for the player. Both guys always put the customer first. And that's actually a rarity, especially nowadays. There's a great Victor Lucas interview where Ed says, "I think the industry is focusing a little too much on graphics right now, and not enough on gameplay innovation. It's imperative one keeps up with the other, and Ed's absolutely right." I'll go back to Rush 2049, particularly the Dreamcast version. I remember reading an IGN preview where Ed said Sega of Japan had still yet to deliver the tools needed to add online multiplayer, and that Midway management was just refusing to delay the game to November. Ready or not, it would ship September 2000. On top of all this, Ed was short a programmer, so he asked the team to focus on the Nintendo 64 version, where admittedly they had previously released 2 Rush titles, so they were familiar with the system. This was done so Ed could roll up his sleeves and take over the Dreamcast version himself, until they could find someone. Again, like Bernie, Ed's a straight shooter, totally willing to say no and walk out. This isn't right. And at the same time, he's the guy diving into the trenches, willing to get dirty and get the job done. And that's another rarity.
I'm a huge fan of Rush 2049. It's probably my favorite game on the Sega Dreamcast. Eagle-eyed viewers of this video may note that this playing in the background is not the Dreamcast version. It's actually the Nintendo 64 version that's playing on my lovely CRT in the background. It was with the release of Rush 2049 though that I think the series reached its zenith, if that's the right term, a triumph really of great visuals, really inventive new features with the wings that could extend from the cars, great futuristic setting with some absolutely brilliant track design and really nice set pieces as well. For example, in one of the tracks, you come over the crest of a hill and you've got these jets that come flying over you. The first time you see it, it's just like, wow, I wasn't expecting that. That was really cool the first time I saw that. And every time after I saw it as well, to be honest. You know, you can't really compare them to things like Gran Turismo, even though they're racing games, they're not really in the same vein. It's more of just a complete arcade style racing series that does away with the boredom, the boringness of reality. You know, you've got these exaggerated physics, these crazy jumps, stunt modes, the collectathons. Certainly in the 2049 release, some fantastic visuals. The 4-player split screen mode is a lot of fun. I'm just really honoured to be able to share my love for the San Francisco Rush franchise, really, and to doff my cap. You know, if I was wearing one, I would. To Ed Logg for this fantastic series in his long and illustrious career.
Rush is still a fun game, and I think it. You know, I don't know that for sure, but when I play with something like Burnout, I mean that's like that love transfers, and like it feels like the DNA a little bit of Rush comes into something like Burnout. They feel like it's like a natural evolution of what Rush was doing. So I guess if you like the Burnout series, you know, and you could go back and play Rush, and you probably would kind of see some of. I would be surprised if Criterion didn't get inspiration from Rush, because they feel like cousins.
If there was a game that like stood out more than any other in college, it was San Francisco Rush 2049, you know, right next to Tony Hawk 2 and that soundtrack, and for completely unknown reasons, Looney Tunes Space Race, but that has nothing to do with anything. San Francisco Rush, specifically the battle arenas, that was my Mario Kart, basically, even though that's not even analogous in like the point of the game. But the racing was fine, but the battle arenas were the thing where there were leaderboards written on cardboard in my room. There were times where seeded players had to show up, and we did round robin tournaments. We made our own rules about it. I mean, it was the most heated competition I experienced in college. And that includes the fact that I was pretty active in like Division III sports. So like those memories are so clear to me. I remember I had I was a design major, and one of our assignments was to build a chair, which is like a formative design exercise. Like it sounds simple, but you had to build a chair out of cardboard. It had to function, and you would sit on it as part of your final exam, and if it fell apart, you failed. But it also hopefully was beautiful. I built my chair as a lounge chair to sit in to play San Francisco Rush, and it survived, and it stayed in my room, and it was so important to me, not that like the chair functioned for the final, although that was important. It was more important that like I had a thing to sit in, like basically my throne of dominating San Francisco Rush Battle Arena. And that's like one of my core memories from college. So I mean, a big thank you to Ed for that. I do have to say that it also contributed to me playing a little bit too much San Francisco Rush and having to have some difficult conversations with some professors about why I was doing poorly in areas that really required almost no thought, and explaining to them that like 4 hours of my day was being dedicated to a battle arena video game didn't really go through to them very well. I don't think they knew what any of the words I was saying meant at that time. But you know, I passed. So, and after that game, I sort of readjusted, how much time I put into, or how obsessive I would get with certain games, especially ones that had modes that could like explode out into like never-ending competitive gaming, which is very commonplace now. But back when you were making your own competitions, when you weren't online, when you were like building these things yourself, I don't know, they just felt a little bit more special, and it wasn't addictive because you wanted to be on the leaderboards, although that was fun too. It was addictive because you wanted to show your friend like how well you did. You wanted to point at the screen and be like, look, I did it, look how good I am, right? And that was your little world too. Only very few people had like an expansive view of like the best in the world at his games, right? I think most of us were just playing them with their buddies and looking at the screen and being like, oh man, look what I did. I think it's like a real understanding of the core needs to make a fun game. There's like a few things you have to get right, and that's what's the most important. And he understands the core of what makes a game just hit with the most people possible. And like, it's pretty interesting because I guess if I had to draw a line from what I was experiencing in San Francisco Rush 2049 Dreamcast, it would go directly to like Rocket League. But like San Francisco Rush 2049 was really one of the first times where like it just felt complete and like it was accomplishing exactly what it was trying to do. Like the connection between the controls and what I was seeing on the screen, and the fact that it was taking place in 3 dimensions, it didn't feel compromised at all. My memories of it are still like, yeah, this is exactly perfect. This is exactly what I want to be experiencing when I pick up the controller. It was just right in that way. And it's always funny because nostalgia is such a potent drug. And when you go back and now you can look at any game on YouTube and you're like, oh, that was quite early. That's what 400 pixels looks like, right? Like, whoa, that was not how I remembered it. But I remember it as photorealism. I remember like being in those cars.
Hopefully you can see that I am repping the Rush 2049 t-shirt here as well.
These games have a strong legacy, and they still hold up very well today. If you've never tried them, I have to recommend seeking out Rush 2049 for the Dreamcast. It was under the Midway Games West label that Ed Logg worked on his final published home console game, Dr. Muto.
Oh boy. I don't remember the starts of it, but console games got to the point where we had like 40 people, working on a game, probably, at least 30 to 40 people. It was one of the first games I was not product manager on. I was just kind of lead programmer on the game side, not lead programmer on the rendering side. They need big teams, and the problem with big teams is you could be the greatest designer, greatest programmer in the world. I was not designer on that. There was somebody else, game designer, rather inexperienced one, I'm afraid. But when you have 6-8 programmers, I can't do everything, and the only things I can work on are small parts of the game. And so my impact gets diluted. It's not like me doing a home console where I am the man, doing everything on the game, where you really see it. So my contributions really get diluted. We did an amazing prototype showing them what it was going to be, and I wish our game turned out more like the prototype. But we got into the classic consumer crunch where you had to get it ready for Christmas. And I remember coming up and having President Midway question whether we could get it done. I said, look, it may not be the game we want, but it will get done for Christmas, period. You have not asked this question yet, but I think my greatest strength is actually project management, because all my games have come in on time and under budget in a lot of cases too. And I've had some serious problems with that. And for consumer, when you're trying to hit Christmas mark, that's really important. And I've seen other people's designs, and you go over through them, just shake your head and say, not going to get done on time. They don't, simple basic math, it's not going to work. My record speaks for myself. Things get done when I said they're going to get it done. Not like a lot of designers who it gets done when they think it's done.
Despite many sources online citing Ed as the lead designer, he was actually a lead programmer on the game. Dr. Muto is a 3D platformer that was released for the Xbox, PlayStation 2, and GameCube. There was also a separate game under the same name, developed by Digital Eclipse for the Game Boy Advance.
You know, we go through all these great games that Ed worked on, and then, you know, his sort of final big project at Midway was doing something different, which, I mean, at the time, you were just seeing a lot of 3D platformers start to come out. Dr. Muto, to me, held a special place. I've never been a huge Crash Bandicoot fan, to be honest. Dr. Muto had a little bit more story and a lot more personality. You know, it's unfortunate that I think it hit right at a time where there were a bunch of other platformers and it didn't take off. And it sort of hit this period of, you know, kind of the end of what Midway was in its moment. And it was a real risk in a lot of ways from all the other stuff that Ed did. You know, everything else you hear and be talking about, you know, these are sort of arcade games mostly that got ported to console, and just had some simple element to it that just made it refreshing and replayable. You know, this is an end-to-end story-driven, you know, closed-level platformer, you know, but the interesting thing was you played as this mad scientist who could transform into different animals to solve puzzles, you know, and it is unfortunate that, you know, I don't know that it holds up as much today as some of the arcade games, and that's just because platformers have come such a long way from what that was. But it is still this stamp in time of the bridge between kind of what platformers used to be, which were overly simplistic, oftentimes 2D, no real story, usually no voiceover. I mean, even nowadays, Mario doesn't really have voiceover, right? To like much more advanced and detailed, Dak and Jackster and Ratchet and Clank, right? And this game sort of sits as the bridge that almost the technology and capability couldn't maybe meet the vision of what the game wanted to be, but is sort of in between these two eras. And so if you love playing like these kind of platformers, right, most likely you never played it because I don't think it sold very well. But, you know, if you kind of want a historical perspective, playing it now and playing through these other ones and seeing the evolution, I think you can actually kind of see where it sits in the sort of evolution of a platformer. You know, if you think about the evolution of man pictures, right? Like Dr. Muta's sort of in there in the middle phase of it. And so that's what's really cool about it. And then for me personally, you know, this was one of the first games that I ever reviewed, and it is a bridge in my life too, because I had friends who actually worked at Midway, and I used to hang out with them and stuff like that, and I saw them working on Dr. Muto before I ever got to play it from a reviewer standpoint, and so, you know, it's sort of part of my entryway into gaming too, and you know, it's a shame that we'll never get like a proper Dr. Muto, you know, remake, remaster, whatever you say, because it has a lot of cool ideas to it that if you combine that with what they're able to do nowadays with platformers, like it can make it really fun and exciting. I mean, just imagine, you know, you're locked into a handful of animals that are used for very specific like puzzle solving in Dr. Muto. If you made that game nowadays, right, you'd have these open sandbox areas where you have a bunch of different animals that Dr. Muto could turn himself into and multiple ways to solve things. And you can think about how you could hide all these collectibles based on the animals. And you could Metroidvania stuff. Like, so it's like the, you know, there's that doesn't exist. That capability for that kind of game didn't really exist when this came out. But there's still like a lot of fresh ideas in there that if somebody took them now could make something truly amazing.
The story revolves around a mad scientist character named Dr. Muto, who accidentally blows up a planet while attempting to solve an energy crisis. To right his wrongs, he has to travel around the universe and collect or steal everything he'll need to reconstruct the planet that he destroyed. The game plays out as a traditional early 2000s collect-a-thon, but with a twist. Dr. Muto has a device called the Spliz Gun that can splice DNA, allowing the doctor to collect DNA samples of different animals and then combine them with his own. Throughout the game, he can take on the form of 6 different creatures, each with their own feel and mechanics. While many outlets gave the game a 70 to 80% rating, it was not a major success, and Midway Games West was closed shortly after its release. Many factors could be to blame for Dr. Muto's performance. For some key figures involved in the game, it was unexplored territory. Ed Logg stated that the size of the team was magnitudes larger than any that he had worked with before. The lead designer on the game was Mark Simon, and this was his first time filling that role on a production. From what I've read online, this was also the first time that art director Steve Caterson and producer Scott Amos took on senior roles, and this appears to have been the first game design role for Justin Hendry, who was previously credited as a tester on Rush 2049. A lot of the Midway Games West staff working on Dr. Muto had previously worked together on one or more of the Rush titles with Ed Logg, but this was still a new venture for the team, and the game was given a very tight deadline. This was also a very busy time for the market, with Dr. Muto having been released just 2 weeks after Grand Theft Auto Vice City, which at the time was the fastest selling game ever made.
Yeah, don't do that. I released a game against a GTA game once, and it's a big mistake.
Despite being overshadowed at the time of its release, the game has developed a new player base as new generations of gamers dig into previous eras of gaming, detached from anything that may have bogged down the game back in 2002. Even if Dr. Muto could have overcome all of these obstacles, there was a lot of turnover and change going on at Midway Games. Gaming in general was shifting away from the arcades, and many people and companies who had spent decades working in that industry were being forced to change course. While names like Midway and Atari would go on for some time, with Atari still active today, they were often either holding companies or just brand names being passed around to the highest bidder. To give a little more context and history, when the Atari Inc. division of Warner Communications lost $500 million in the first 3 quarters of 1983, that was part of the whole big 1983 video game market crash, its arcade coin-op division was the only one to make money. In 1984, Warner sold Atari's consumer products division, that's the one that makes the home consoles. They sold it to Jack Tramiel, the founder of Commodore. He named this company Atari Corporation. Warner retained the coin-op division, or arcade division, and a few other assets, and changed the name of Atari Inc. to Atari Games Inc. The agreement between Tramiel and Warner Communications was that Atari Games must always include the games after Atari on its logo, and that Atari Games could not use the Atari brand at all in the consumer market, meaning computers and home consoles. Atari Games retained most of the same employees and managers that had worked at the old Atari Inc. It was able to carry on with many of its projects from before the transition. Atari Corp, in contrast, froze projects and streamlined staff and operations. In 1985, Warner Communications and Namco jointly formed a new corporation, AT Games Inc., and Warner transferred the coin-operated games division of Atari Games to the new corporate entity. Namco owned the controlling interest in the new company, while Warner retained 60%. Warner subsequently renamed Atari Games Inc. to Atari Holdings Inc., and AT Games became Atari Games Corporation. Namco later lost interest in operating Atari Games and sold 33% of its shares to a group of employees led by Hideyuki Nakajima, who had been president of Atari Games since 1985. As the company was now split between 3 entities, with Warner at 40%, Namco at 40%, and the employees with the remaining 20%, none of them held a controlling share, so Atari Games effectively became an independent company. In 1989, Warner Communications merged with Time Inc., forming Time Warner. In 1994, Time Warner reacquired a controlling interest in Atari Games and made it a subsidiary of its Time Warner Interactive division. In April 1996, the company was sold to WMS Industries, owner of the Williams, Bally, and Midway arcade brands, which restored the use of the Atari Games name, while the home consumer division was folded into Williams Entertainment. On April 6, 1998, the video game assets of WMS Industries were spun off as a new independent company called Midway Games, which then gained control of the Atari Games division. Meanwhile, Hasbro Interactive acquired the Atari brand for the home market from JTS Corporation that same year. With the changes in ownership of the two companies, on November 19, 1999, Atari Games Corporation was renamed Midway Games West, Inc., resulting in the Atari Games name being retired. In 2001, due to a decline in the market, Midway Games exited the arcade industry. Despite this, Midway Games West continued to produce games for the home market until, after a sales slump, it was disbanded on February 7, 2003. Although no longer in operation, Midway Games West continued to exist as a holding entity for the copyrights and trademarks of the games originally from Atari Games. In February 2009, Midway Games filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. And in July 2009, most of Midway's assets were sold to Warner Bros. Interactive Entertainment, ultimately bringing all of the Atari properties back to Warner again.
We talk about the founding fathers of the United States who, you had Thomas Jefferson, you had George Washington, you had Ben Franklin, Adams, and you have all these great minds, and somehow they're in the right place at the right time, and they create this amazing thing. Obviously, I'm not going to say it's to the same level, but that's really kind of how I feel about Atari. They happened to be in the right place. They were attracted at the right time. And really, truly, the rest of the world in a lot of ways stands on their shoulders. And this coming from somebody who knew and loved Ralph Baer. I mean, Ralph Baer was always very, very kind and very friendly. And I mean, clearly Nolan will admit that they ripped off Ralph Baer with, Pong was a ripoff of Odyssey. And Steve Russell, of course, created Space War. But in the end, the shoulders they're really standing on are Atari's.
Ed would retire in 2013, but prior to that, he bounced around several different ventures, working either as an advisor or as a programmer. He worked on some mobile games through a startup called Gen Play Games, and also did some contract work for Active Video Networks, who developed games that were played on TV set-top boxes.
Because later on, I went to work for a startup that did games on set-top boxes. Your cable set-top boxes, you can play video games on your home screen. And they wanted to do Tetris for the home screen. So Sangeeta Verma went to, I think, Blue Planet in Hawaii at the time, which owned the rights to it. And so she walked in, and the president got up and gave his spiel and then pointed to Tengen Tetris. Says, "Now that's the best version ever done of Tetris." And she just smiled about, "Yeah, the same programmer did that one's going to be doing ours."
I worked with them again. I worked with them probably about 10, 15 years ago. There was another company who were doing set-top TV things, games. God, I can't remember the name of the company, but they were doing all these like solitaire games and battleship games. I did a few of those for those guys. I think it was Pablo who was my trainee. He was one of the games testers that wanted to get into programming. He'd got a job with them out in the Bay Area. I'd moved off to New York. I was working at Fisher-Price Toys. Pablo got back in touch with me. He says, "Hey, you want to do the music for a poker game for a set-top box?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure, whatever." And he's like, "Well, we've not got much money." He says, "Just need a 30-second title tune and some sound effects or whatever." I'm like, "All right, well, I'm trying to think how much to charge him." And he's like, "Well, the problem is we've only got about $200, but we do about 30 of these a year." I'm like, "Oh, you have my attention."
Personally speaking, knowing that there are defunct pieces of hardware out there that might still contain copies of some of these games drives me crazy. Seeing games become inaccessible due to shifts in the market is something that many gamers find frustrating.
I mean, there are people that came out, they basically copied the EEPROMs and wrote emulators for a lot of the old arcade games. And, I really empathized with them because they had these old games that were really well done, and they wanted to get them on a new platform, your PC or, whatever. And I hate to see the old games die. So for me, that was the case. Yes, I do sympathize with that particular movement. It was kind of, copyright be damned. Yeah, I wanted people to see them. I mean, as long as you're not making money off of the product, then yeah, that's fine. If you're making money off of it, no, you're going to pay licensing fee. I'm sorry, guys.
In reflecting on Ed's body of work, I find myself thinking about the different eras of the video game industry. When Ed began working in games, commercially viable games could be made by teams of anywhere from 1 to 4 people. Over the preceding decades, the size of game development teams would balloon to the point that some games are now made by teams of hundreds of people. And at the moment, we can see many examples of studios buckling under their own weight. Over the past 15 or so years, things have shifted to allow solo developers and much smaller teams to create games that have been wildly successful, with titles like Balatro and Vampire Survivors being some recent examples. The hardware and software used to create games has become so accessible that we've seen several new generations of auteur game developers, many of whom self-identify as artists and creators of these games. When discussing the development of Centipede, Donna Bailey said that she didn't really know what a creator was, and that she just always saw herself as a programmer. While chatting with Ed, I asked him if he saw himself as an artist, and he had the same response. He was first and foremost a programmer.
No, I never considered myself an artist. I considered myself a programmer. Artist to me was drawing, graphic art, that kind of stuff, and I was not doing that. Although I did do it for Centipede and Asteroids and early games, and we didn't have preset artists to do stuff. That changed later, of course, with Gauntlet and Roadrunner and stuff like that. But early days, I'd do my own, but I never considered myself an artist. Now, an artist from the standpoint of a creative facility, all right, fine, yes, I was creative. I was an artist from that standpoint, but I never wrote myself off as an artist. I was always programmer, manager.
Let's talk about games as art, okay? Roger Ebert, do you remember why Roger Ebert said games could never be art? He had a bunch of BS reasons, not the least of which was that he saw games as a collaboration between the artist and the viewer. Okay, boy, is that ever conjured out of crap. First of all, let me say, Roger Ebert was a great film reviewer. I learned a lot about journalism from watching Roger Ebert. So I am about to put him down, but I think he did some amazing things. And he said something that was so interesting that really informed a lot of my thinking. He and Gene Siskel were reviewing the movie Scooby-Doo. It was a live-action adaptation of Scooby-Doo. And he said, I understand there's a cartoon. And I thought to myself, what the hell are you doing reviewing this movie if you've never even seen the damn cartoon? What gives you the right? And he answered it. And to this day, I think about what he said because it was so brilliant. What he said was, if I have to watch the cartoon to appreciate the movie, then it's nothing but an extended inside joke. That is a brilliant insight. That changed the way I write books. That changed the way I look at movies. It's a brilliant insight. He's exactly right. Okay, but do you ever go dancing with your wife? Did you write the music you were dancing to? Then I guess you were collaborating with the artist, weren't you? So maybe music doesn't qualify as art? Do you know who Yoko Ono is? She showed up in a pretty little dress. Actually, it was a pretty long dress. for I think $10 each, people could come up and snip a piece of her dress away. Surprise, surprise, it was mostly men who did that. But I don't know. That seems to me an awful lot like a collaboration. How about you? Did you ever see the movie Groundhog's Day? Remember the end where he's playing the Rhapsody? Do you think that's how that piece of music was written to be played? Somebody took the music and collaborated with the creator to create a brand new piece of art. And I'll go a step beyond that. You watch some of the great game players take these games and figure out how to use them in ways they were never meant to be used. That's creating new art.
Yeah, no, and that era when the team was so small, right, that there was not, you wouldn't have someone who just came up with ideas for something that it took one person 6 months to make. It just never was like, better to have them just have the ideas and then have 20 of them and then see what the best things are coming out of that versus having, half as many, but each one has a designer who only, because when you're doing that sort of programming, it's not like there was a level editor for the original Centipede or something, right? It was like, no, that's all just in the code. And it has to be in the code because there's no overhead for like some fancy data format thing that you have to make to lay this out. It's just all so limited based on the constraints. And so it made sense that, all the creators had to be programmers. And I think, a lot of them just sort of wandered into it a little bit because they didn't grow up with games and go into an arcade and think, oh my God, I'm 5 years old and this is blowing my mind and I'm so inspired. I've got to do this and I want to go to college, but thinking about doing this and that's going to be my whole point. It was like, no, they were programmers and then this thing appeared, which was video games. And they're like, oh, that's neat. Maybe I'll do that. So they're just coming to it later in life without that sort of childhood dream aspect. And then just, it being such a new thing. Is it just a fad? Is this even going to last? Right. I remember there was the crash of 83, 84. And it's like, well, video games are done. Like there was a lot of that conclusion going on. And, Nintendo didn't think so, but a lot of other people did. And it's just sort of like, well, we did that thing until it didn't happen anymore. And, oh, well, we'll do the next thing now, which is, the hula hoop or something, whatever the new fad, whether the Teddy Ruxpin is the new source of programming, right? So it's easy to see how people thought of it that way. And I've certainly met from that generation other designers, programmers, creators who, don't identify that way at all. And they're just like, well, this is the thing I did and it was neat. There are some mixed in there though, who, definitely if you talk to like Brian Moriarty, like a Infocom guy, and then LucasArts and the Loom guy and stuff like that. Like, he always knew he was being creative, and that was the goal, and identified that way. I think I don't want to put words in Brian's mouth, but there's more of the Ed Logg types out there. I find the same thing because I'm a fan of like old cinema too, and like old Hollywood films, and it was just a very business-oriented enterprise for many. For decades before every director became an artist and stuff like that later. And, John Ford, the director of Stagecoach and The Searchers and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, all these amazing films, dated to their period, though they may be a bit, great works of art. He hated being asked questions about making art because, some guys from Cahiers du Cinema from France would come over and ask him questions about this, and he just resented all those questions. And he'd say, well, why did you decide to make this movie? And he said, a paycheck. That was the only answer he would give. So there's some sort of interesting overlap as sort of the early adopters of a form, doing this amazing work, but not in this sort of reverential way.
Is Ed an artist or not? Are these games art or not? I think, if you define art as a creative expression to make you feel something, then obviously the games are art, and then what it makes you feel. And also think back to, I think those are powerful things, and that you have a connection. I've been to a lot of museums in my life. There's very few pieces of art that I actually remember seeing in all of those times, right? I might have felt something in the moment. But in games, we can talk about something that we played 30, 35 years ago, and it recalls something to us, right? And it puts us back into a place. It puts us back into an understanding of a time that we existed, that it existed within, and it has some context and cultural value to it. So, I mean, yeah, of course, like that aspect is art. I went to the MoMA once, and there was a room that was just filled with Hershey's chocolate, which you could pick up the Hershey's chocolate if you wanted to, and that's interactive art, right? So if I could eat a Hershey's chocolate off the floor with like 20 other visitors, then I think that Asteroid and me plugging and shooting asteroids, like I feel like that counts as art.
Tell me that's not an artist.
Right.
Tell me that somebody that's dreaming up how to play something in their imagination isn't an artist, isn't not only an artist, but a virtuoso, isn't a Mozart in their field, you know? I mean, the best composers in history are hearing their music before we hear it, you know, before they play it. And game developers are the same. If they're playing their game, they're artists, man.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I'm thinking of the technical limitations at the end. I mean, for years, I refused to refer to myself as a composer because I thought it sounded pretentious. You know, just I don't know if it's that Scottish thing where you're not supposed to think above your station, but I don't know. It wasn't until there was a Brazilian DJ who'd done a remix of one of my tunes, and she'd made a comment about my music being my art, and it really stuck with me. It took me several months of thinking about it to realize that, yeah, I suppose I am creating art. And then with Horizon Chase Turbo, that was I think I said that I couldn't have hoped for a better game for my music to be in, just because it is a work of art. It's an art piece, you know. It's a nostalgic throwback to video games from the old days. But we never thought of games as art when we were creating them. I mean, it was a job, because I mean, we either made video games as a job or we went and got a real job. That was your choices at the time. You weren't trying to change the world. I mean, you see some wonderful artistic games these days where, you know, things are, whether it's through abstract art and music and stuff, people trying to make statements through their games. We just wanted to make fun games at the time. It's nice that it's evolved to that, you know, because it's been accepted as an artistic medium.
There was a time where video games were not viewed as art, and while some might still argue the nuances of the topic, video games have largely come to be accepted as an art form, and as such, many game developers are viewed as artists. But there's an interesting distinction to be made here. Through the use of certain software and tools, there are many games being made today by people who have no programming knowledge or abilities. Even if the modern lens views a game like Asteroids as a work of art, at its core, it is still the work of a programmer, which brings me back around to my view of Ed Logg as a true video game pioneer. Things were very different back then.
No, at the time, I really thought I was doing something new. And part of that, as I mentioned earlier, it's because I was an early pioneer. I could do that stuff, and it was all new. If I tried to do something now, it would be some parts of some other game. And you can't, it's really hard to come up with something truly unique now.
Today, someone can use visual scripting, plugins, and pre-made assets to produce a basic Gauntlet clone in a matter of minutes. To create Gauntlet back in the mid-1980s, Ed Logg and others at Atari had to file 5 patents and develop new, exclusive hardware just to make the game work.
The Mach 32, which we did for Gauntlet, was really an amazing piece of hardware. And I have a bunch of patents on that from the ideas Pat McCarthy and I used to create that game.
It's the difference between traveling down a road and being the person to actually engineer and then pave that road.
You know, for me, I just felt lucky to be there at the right time, at the right place. That's really, you know, I was always into this stuff. So for me, I got paid doing something I really loved. I loved doing. And for me, it was often a challenge. I was not your typical programmer, you know, that would work till midnight and get up, you know, wake up at noon and work till midnight. You know, I had kids, so I was, you know, your 9 to your 8:30 to 5:30, 8 to 5:30 type employee. So I was different than your typical programmer too.
Yeah, that I've read a lot of seems like there was quite a bit of debauchery that went down at times.
Oh yeah. I was not part of that.
Ed Logg, alongside many of his colleagues, pioneered the early video gaming landscape and gave us decades worth of games to enjoy and learn from.
This is amazing material to go over, like people should know who Ed Logg is. They should have an understanding of what he has contributed to culture. You've seen, even if you've never played his work, you've seen it. It's been a part of stories. It's been a part of other people's game ideas. It's been a background element in a movie or a TV show where someone has talked about it, or written music about it. I'm sure there's something about Asteroids or something like that. Maybe some awesome rap tune or something. It's incredible. And I count myself so privileged to, and I think it worked out pretty good for me to have been a fan for so long before I became someone that covered it, and to appreciate it from its inception, to just be obsessed with it, to read all the magazines of the 80s and to hear about these people and about these new things that were coming. And then later on to get to come at it from that perspective. I don't know if it would have been the same if my life was moved forward another 10 years. I don't know if I would have done EP then, like it worked out that's what I was supposed to do, I guess, right? Like I've been doing this for 30 freaking years. So I guess that's what I was supposed to do. And put the camera in Ed Logg's face, even if he didn't want it,
In summary, it's impossible to truly give Ed his due. I think this whole project, when we're done with it, is going to clock in around 4 hours or so. And honestly, it's still not enough. Far from it. Ed's a genius and yet so down to earth and humble. A truly, truly nice man. I say he's down to earth, but at the same time, to do what he does, that mind almost has to be from another world.
I've had the honor of interviewing Donna Bailey before as well. Just a text interview for Arcade Attack. And obviously she worked with Ed on Centipede, which is another classic game. And, he and Donna and Nolan Bushnell, absolutely legends who paved the way for these unbelievable games. I put my hands up a bit before my time, a lot of the games he worked on, but for me, there was no genres back then. They created genres. They set the groundwork. They set the kind of rules in motion, sort of wheels in motion.
I'm working on the first quarter, and what I do is I just fly down. My wife may have been happy to get rid of me for 3 weeks at a time, but I'd fly down to that area, and I'd spend 3 weeks there. Or there was a point where I did a 3-week, maybe a 6-week tour of the East Coast, just trying to find everybody. And somebody gave me information that led me to Ed Logg, and I went to meet Ed Logg and his wife, and we went out to dinner. A lot of the interview was done over a Chinese dinner, and I tend to put on weight quickly, so I spend a lot of time on keto. So he was amazed at the lack of fear I had eating very greasy Chinese roast duck. It's like, bring it on. The more grease, the better. I'm on keto. Doesn't actually work that way, but it felt good. But we had a great conversation. And, I told him that I'm looking for these other people, and he arranged those other interviews for me, or at least put me in touch with them. He was incredibly gracious. He just, every way you look at it, when I'm going to call him a simple guy, but not simple in the way that, it's simplistic mind, obviously a great mind. But what you see is what you get. There isn't any guile. He's not out for ego. He just, he helps you out because he's happy to help you out.
I think you're right all around. I think Ed's influence is still everywhere. It's felt really heavily still in the industry. And the fact that Ed, stayed relevant for decades as well. You think, a lot of the kind of golden age developers that we talk to on the podcast, a lot of them kind of dropped off when the technology shifted. But you think, yeah, all the stuff that Ed did, I mean, you know, starting from the first days of the arcades, through the North American video game crash, and, you know, the way that Atari went back then as well, the NES kind of being the rebirth of that in America, and then even going into like the 3D era through the N64 and the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube, and, you know, working on early mobile gaming, and even stuff like, you know, cable set-top box gaming. I think in terms of careers in video games, having one that's that long and kind of was spawned through so many different revolutions, I think is very rare.
I was born in 81, which I think is important because my mom purchased our first game systems because she was bored while she was pregnant. And so when you grew up in the 80s, Ed's games were omnipresent, and you learned about them and you saw them and you saw people playing them before you understood that people made these things, right? Like they existed as just like toys existed or your favorite Disney films. You didn't understand that there were animators or coders or any of that. And that's really formative because Ed then became associated with games that were just like some of the most important things to a child of that age. Like, I don't know anything, but I know I want to play an arcade game that looks like that. And then that sort of became what a video game is, you know, sort of like in the way that people say like, oh, I play Madden, you know, and they don't say what year, and they don't talk about video games writ large. That's just what they do. His games were like video games. That's just what they were. That's how they were defined. Like, those images are burned into all of our memories from that era.
I also think stuff like first-person shooters have been influenced by Gauntlet. Looking at Ken's Labyrinth, which was the kind of first title by Ken Silverman, who did the build engine, which then went on to Duke Nukem 3D. Later, huge titles like that had massive development and changes, like stack sectors and stuff like that, going into FPS technology. That pretty much looks like a 3D Gauntlet. Seeing that first demo of Ken's Labyrinth and what was released when he was, I think, 14 years old, he put that out, and then John Romero paid some attention to it, helped him tune it up, and we have the kind of foundations of first-person shooters there.
It was such a incredible time in game design. Like, I've watched games from the beginning to current present, and back then there was something so special about making a game and then like going on to your next project. And you look at what Ed Logg had created in his games, and they didn't really, well, he had sequels and stuff. Each one was so unique from one another. Like, it didn't really tread upon like the same ground. Like you get with fighting games, like somebody's doing a fighting game, they go on and make another fighting game. They just go from fighting game to fighting game, and mechanics change. But with this catalog of games, like going from Asteroids that had such unique movement, where the buttons, yet your button layout was so unique and above like a Space Invaders, which was just left and right, and this you had full screen movement. And then in Centipede they pulled it back, but with the trackball it gave you such speed and ability, and it was, I guess they did have the same shooting and precision shots and movement, but they were approached so differently. And by Gauntlet too, you go from like these movement shooters to Gauntlet, which is so big and exploratory, and just the diversity of how you're playing and stuff. It was incredible. It really showed the depth of how a designer and from the programming side, it wasn't about just recreating the same thing, the same success they just did. It was about doing something different and new And these games are just that. They're not just kind of like a reimagination of the last game. They're just new.
And yeah, he saw the birth and the death and the birth and the death and the and the birth and the death of games again and again. You know, like that's so cool. You know, and his resume is unbelievable, and the brands that he has created are endlessly endurable. Like people will be playing Gauntlet and Centipede and San Francisco Rush forever. You know, they'll find ways and they'll come back and they'll be reimagined and reinvented, and they will come from him. And you know, what's driven me my whole half my life, my whole career is to respect that ambition, you know, is to tell some of these stories and let these people know who these people are, you know, not let them just disappear behind their work. Let's understand a little bit about the human aspiration and the desire to entertain and how inspiring that is. And I don't know, like, I don't know if young people today quite have that appreciation, because there's been this consistent commentary around video games and a consistent it's a consistent element of people's lives. But I am from a generation where they weren't there, you know, and then it felt like they were all of a sudden there. It's like, what? You know, we can look at a television and we can move stuff around on that television. We can interact with little things on that TV. And it's really hard to convey how profound that is, you know, like we don't think like that anymore. The world has moved on far from that. We don't have any, like, now we're buying robots to clean our houses. You know, we're at this point, you know, but yeah, I was from a time when it blipped on, and Ed Logg was one of those people that made it so, you know. He was one of those human beings that saw the problem to solve, and he solved it, and he's entertained millions of people. And yeah, I don't know if Ed Logg would ever remember EP coming to visit him, but I'll never forget going to visit Ed Logg.
Well, I was honored to get to work with him. It was absolutely fantastic. For me, it really felt like I'd made it, getting to go and work at Atari with Ed. That was the key thing, with Ed Logg, the guy that made Asteroids.
While this video is an attempt to document some of that work, it is by no means an exhaustive account of his accomplishments. If you'd like to learn more about Ed Logg and his work in video games, I'll leave a list of links down below to other videos, interviews, and articles that explore all of these ideas even further. I want to thank you for watching this video, and I want to thank Jordan Freeman and Zoom Platform again for connecting me with Ed. And of course, I want to say thank you one more time to Ed Logg for his time. If you enjoyed this video, we have plenty more deep dives here on the channel. You might enjoy my look at the microgames genre, exploring everything that came before and after WarioWare, this look at the development history and impact of Scorn, or this look at the games inspired by the works of Clive Barker. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.
What's your name? Start with a C. Start with a G. Start with a Z. Nothing nasty now. What's your name? Spell it. H-I-J-K-L-M-N-O-P. That's how you spell it. What's your name? What's your name? That's your name.